Welcome, my friend. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Before we begin, take a moment to make your space comfortable. Dim the lights, pull the blanket closer, and let your breathing slow down. This is your time to relax. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to gently press like, subscribe, and leave a small comment about where you're listening from. It's always wonderful to know we are sharing this journey across the world. Tonight, we travel back through time to a moment of unimaginable darkness in human history. The 14th century, when an invisible killer swept across Europe, leaving tens of millions dead in its wake. Yet hidden within the bones of the victims and within the DNA of their descendants lies a remarkable secret. The story of why some perished and why others survived. So now, let your mind drift and let the story begin. The 14th century was, in many ways, a paradoxical time. On the surface, it was an era of growth, faith, and the steady hum of everyday life. Beneath, however, it was fragile, fractured, and already straining under the weight of famine, inequality, and superstition. To understand the Black Death, we must first understand the Europe that existed before the first plague ship docked, before the first bell tolled for the dying. This is the story of a continent poised unknowingly on the edge of catastrophe. Imagine yourself standing in a small village in rural France, around the year 1345. The air smells of smoke from hearth fires. You hear the steady clink of the blacksmith's hammer striking hot iron, the laughter of children chasing each other in the mud of the central square, the soft murmur of women exchanging gossip while drawing water from the well. Chickens cluck, dogs bark, and in the distance the church bell tolls the hour. Life seems simple, cyclical, and secure. People live by the turning of the seasons, planting, tending, harvesting, and praying. It is a world deeply tied to the soil, to faith, and to tradition. But this world was also one of profound inequality. The feudal system governed nearly every relationship. At the top were kings, lords, and the nobility, wielding wealth and privilege. The church stood beside them, not only as a spiritual guide but as one of the greatest landholders and political powers in Europe. Below them, vast numbers of peasants tilled the land, bound to their lords by obligations and taxes that left them perpetually burdened. To be born into poverty was, for most, to die in poverty. The rigid structure left little room for movement. The peasants' lives were dictated by the demands of the land and the whims of those above. Faith was not just central, it was everything. Medieval Europeans believed the hand of God touched every aspect of their existence. Illness was often seen as divine punishment. Good harvests were blessings. Famines were chastisements. Superstition flourished in this atmosphere, filling the gaps where knowledge was absent. Few understood disease in medical terms. Instead, invisible forces, sin, demons, or the will of God, were blamed for suffering. When the Black Death came, and prayer alone could not protect them, the crisis of faith would be as devastating as the disease itself. Yet even before plague struck, Europe was already weakened. In the early 1300s, a shift in climate, now known as the Little Ice Age, brought longer, colder winters and unpredictable rains. Crops failed. Famine spread. Between 1315 and 1317, a catastrophe now remembered as the Great Famine devastated much of northern Europe. Crops rotted in the fields, livestock died, and hunger stalked every household. People ate bark, grass, and whatever roots they could dig from the soil. Starvation left bodies frail, immune systems weakened, death rates soared, and birth rates fell. Entire communities shrank. Though the famine eased, its scars lingered. Those who lived carried the memory of hunger in their bones, and their children inherited its weakness. So by the 1340s, Europe was not the picture of robust health we sometimes imagine. Instead, it was a continent already on edge. Population growth of the previous century had stretched resources thin. Cities were crowded, unsanitary, and prone to outbreaks of disease. Trade flourished, bringing wealth, but also carried risks. For every ship that arrived carried not only goods, but also pests. Rats and their fleas thrived in these conditions. And hidden within the fleas was a bacterium that had slumbered in Central Asia, waiting for its moment to explode. Yersinia pestis. The Silk Road, that ancient artery connecting east and west, carried spices, silks, and precious stones, but it also carried death. As caravans moved across the steppes, as merchants sailed from port to port, the plague moved with them, silent and unseen. By the time whispers of strange deaths reached Europe, the wheels of fate were already turning. Picture the bustling harbor of Genoa in 1346. Ships bob in the water, unloading crates of grain, wool, and spices. Merchants haggle in the sunlit market. Children weave between stalls, chasing each other through the crowd. No one notices the rats slipping off the gangplanks, scurrying into alleys. No one notices the fleas clinging to their fur. The plague has arrived, though no one yet knows it. But in 1345, ordinary people carried on. In Florence, bankers counted coins while painters prepared canvases for the great cathedrals. In Venice, gondoliers ferried passengers across shimmering canals. In London, peasants trudged through muddy streets, baskets of turnips slung over their shoulders. Rumors of mysterious deaths in distant lands were dismissed as stories. Foreigners' misfortunes were not seen as their own. They could not imagine that these stories foreshadowed their own fate. Europe before the plague was like a fragile vessel, beautiful but cracked. The famine had thinned its walls. Inequality had widened its fractures. Faith was strong but brittle. All that was needed was one final blow to shatter it completely. That blow would come soon. Within a year, the first victims would fall. Entire towns would be emptied. Priests would refuse last rites. Parents would abandon their children. Society itself would teeter on collapse. And centuries later, in the quiet laboratories of geneticists, the bones of those victims would reveal their hidden story. For DNA remembers what people could not. It recorded why some perished and others survived. It preserved the legacy of natural selection, written not in books, but in the very code of life. And so, to begin this long journey, we must pause here, at the edge of the storm, when Europe still lived in fragile peace, unaware of the devastation about to descend. Life continued, fragile but stubborn. The fields were plowed. The bells rang. The markets bustled. Children laughed in the village squares. Priests delivered sermons, and families gathered for bread and stew. Ordinary days passed, one after another. And then, the storm broke. The Black Death had arrived. When we think of killers, we often imagine something we can see. A blade in the hand of a soldier, the point of an arrow, the glint of a spear. But the greatest killer in the 14th century was invisible, smaller than the eye could ever see, silent and patient. Its name was Yersinia pestis. This tiny bacterium, shaped like a rod under the microscope, became the single most devastating pathogen in European history. It is hard to believe that something so small, so seemingly insignificant, could change the course of civilization. Yet in the 1340s, it did exactly that. The journey of Yersinia pestis began long before Europe. Its ancestral home was in the arid landscapes of Central Asia, where it circulated quietly in rodent populations, gerbils, marmots, and prairie dogs, animals that lived in burrows across the steppes. For centuries, the bacterium remained largely contained there, locked in an ecological balance between rodents and fleas. But trade, exploration, and human ambition broke that balance. Fleas are the true carriers of plague. They feed on the blood of their hosts. When a flea bites an infected rodent, Yersinia pestis multiplies inside its gut. The bacteria form a sticky mass that blocks the flea's digestive tract. Desperate for nourishment, the starving flea bites again and again, regurgitating infected blood back into the wound. In this way, each bite delivers the bacteria into the bloodstream of a new host. When that host is a rat, the infection spreads rapidly among the colony. When that host is a human, the results are catastrophic. Rats were everywhere in medieval Europe. They thrived in cities, feasting on garbage, nesting in walls, hiding in grain stores. Where humans lived, rats lived too. The close companionship between people and rodents created the perfect bridge for the plague. Fleas jumped from rat to man, carrying Yersinia pestis into the bloodstream of unsuspecting victims. The symptoms were terrifying. At first, a fever, a headache, a sense of unease. Then, swellings appeared in the groin, the armpits, the neck, painful, swollen lymph nodes called buboes. They could grow to the size of an egg, darkening, filling with pus and blood. These buboes gave the disease its name, bubonic plague. Victims suffered chills, delirium, and vomiting. Black blotches spread across the skin as blood vessels ruptured beneath the surface. In many cases, death followed within days. To the people of the 14th century, it was as if a curse had fallen upon them. They did not know about bacteria. They did not know about fleas. They saw only the rapid, horrifying transformation of friends, neighbors, and family members into corpses. Whole households perished in a week. Priests who came to give last rites fell ill themselves. Doctors were powerless, their remedies useless. The plague did not discriminate between rich and poor, noble and peasant, devout and sinner. It struck without mercy. The bacterium had multiple forms. The most common was bubonic plague, carried by fleas and marked by the swollen lymph nodes. But there was also septicemic plague, where the bacteria invaded the bloodstream directly, causing sudden fever, internal bleeding, and almost certain death within a day. And then there was pneumonic plague, the most terrifying of all. In this form, Yersinia pestis settled in the lungs. Victims coughed and spat blood, releasing the bacteria into the air. Unlike the flea-borne version, this form spread directly from person to person, leaping through coughs and breath. It could wipe out entire families in hours. What made Yersinia pestis so devastating was not only its lethality, but also its speed. A healthy man could feel a fever in the morning and lie dead by evening. A mother could tuck her children into bed and wake to find them lifeless. The pace of the disease overwhelmed every human system. Families, villages, cities, governments, even the church. There was no time to plan, no time to react, only fear and despair. Modern science tells us why this pathogen was so efficient. Yersinia pestis carries genes that allow it to evade the human immune system. It suppresses the body's early defenses, allowing the bacteria to multiply unchecked. By the time the immune system recognizes the invader, it is too late. Organs fail, blood clots, tissues rot. To medieval people, The process seemed supernatural, like an evil spirit inhabiting the body. In truth, it was the cold logic of bacterial evolution. Ships and trade routes carried the plague across borders. Soldiers besieging cities used corpses of plague victims as weapons, catapulting them over walls to spread terror inside. In one famous account, at the siege of Kaffa in 1346, Mongol forces hurled diseased bodies into the city, sparking an outbreak that drove Italian merchants to flee back to Europe. They carried with them more than just goods. They carried the plague itself. By the time those ships docked in Genoa and Venice, the invisible killer had found a new continent to consume. The Black Death was, in essence, the story of how a microscopic organism exploited the networks of a growing human world. The very connections that brought prosperity, trade, travel, exploration, also became the arteries through which death flowed. And once Yersinia pestis arrived, no wall, no prayer, no wealth could hold it back. Centuries later, when scientists extracted DNA from the teeth of plague victims, they found the genetic fingerprints of Yersinia pestis. Remarkably, the strain that ravaged medieval Europe is almost identical to strains that still exist today. The killer never vanished. It remains in pockets of the world, sleeping in rodent populations, capable of emerging again. But in the 14th century, without antibiotics, without understanding, without hope, it was unstoppable. For the medieval mind, explanations were few. Some believed the plague was spread by poisoned wells. Others thought it was a punishment from God for the sins of mankind. Still others blamed the alignment of the planets or the corruption of the air. None could imagine the true culprit, a tiny bacterium carried by fleas, riding on the backs of rats, slipping silently into the bloodstream. And so Yersinia pestis became the invisible executioner of Europe. It killed without intent, without malice, without pause. It left behind not only graves, but questions that would only be answered centuries later in the double helix of DNA. This is the beginning of the storm. The plague has arrived, the invisible killer unleashed. In the next part of our story, we will walk into the mass graves of Europe where entire communities were buried together. There, in the soil, lie the remains of the fallen, and within their bones, the genetic echoes of both death and survival. The storm has broken, and it is only beginning. Across the landscapes of Europe, beneath the cobblestones of modern cities and the soil of quiet fields, lie the silent witnesses of the Black Death. They are not marked by towering monuments or elaborate tombs, but by long, dark pits, mass graves, dug in desperation as death swept through communities faster than the living could respond. These are the burial places of tens of thousands, where the anonymous dead were laid side by side, their stories forgotten, until archaeologists began to unearth them centuries later. Imagine London in the autumn of 1349. The city was swollen with refugees fleeing from nearby towns. Corpses filled the streets, left in doorways, in alleys, even on church steps. The graveyards could no longer hold the dead, so the city ordered new pits dug beyond its walls. Men worked day and night, lowering bodies into trenches that stretched farther than the eye could see. One chronicler wrote that in London alone, more than 200 bodies were buried in a single grave, layer upon layer, covered hastily with soil before the next wagon of corpses arrived. The same scene repeated across Europe. In Florence, pits overflowed until carts dumped bodies into the river. In Paris, whole fields were turned into cemeteries, hastily consecrated. In Lübeck and Hamburg, the smell of death hung heavy as trenches were filled within days. These mass graves were not places of mourning in the way we might think today. There were no individual funerals, no solemn prayers for each soul. The scale was too immense. The living were too terrified. Survival, not ceremony, dictated the pace. Centuries later, those forgotten graves began to resurface. In 1985, construction workers in London uncovered a vast burial ground at East Smithfield. The skeletons were arranged in rows, evidence of careful but hurried burial. Archaeologists knew immediately what they had found, one of the great plague pits of 1349. Over time, similar discoveries appeared elsewhere: Cambridge, Barcelona, Venice, Toulouse, and beyond. Each grave was a frozen moment of catastrophe, preserved beneath the earth. To stand at the edge of a plague pit is to feel the weight of history pressing close. Imagine looking down into a trench where hundreds of skeletons lie. The bones are tangled, skulls resting against rib cages, femurs crossing over spines. Some still bear the faint traces of clothing or wooden coffins, though most are naked bone, bleached by time. It is not the ordered quiet of a churchyard, but the chaotic stillness of disaster. Each skeleton represents a life cut short, someone who lived, who hoped, who feared, and who became part of the great tide of death. For archaeologists, these graves are not only sites of sorrow, but also treasure troves of information. The soil preserves more than bones. Within teeth, within the hard enamel that resists decay, fragments of DNA remain. Both human DNA and bacterial DNA linger, microscopic traces of the people and the plague that ended them. When scientists first extracted DNA from the teeth of plague victims, they opened a window into the past unlike any before. They found the unmistakable genetic signature of Yersinia pestis, proving beyond doubt that this bacterium was the cause of the Black Death. For centuries, historians had debated whether it was truly plague or some other disease, anthrax, typhus, or an unknown virus. Ancient DNA ended the argument. The pits testified it was plague. But the teeth also revealed something more profound. Within the genomes of the victims themselves lay the story of survival and vulnerability. By comparing the DNA of those who perished with the DNA of modern Europeans, scientists began to uncover patterns. Certain genetic variants, such as the mutation in the ERAP2 gene, seem to have provided some protection against the plague. Those who carried it were more likely to live, to reproduce, to pass it on. The mass graves, therefore, were not just tombs. They were records of natural selection in action, evolutionary experiments written in tragedy. Standing in front of a plague pit today, one might reflect on the strange way history and science intersect. What once was a place of horror and despair has become a source of knowledge and understanding. The people buried there, once lost to anonymity, now speak again, not with voices, but through their DNA, whispering secrets of immunity, of adaptation, of resilience. The excavation of plague pits requires care, respect, and scientific precision. Archaeologists wear gloves and masks as they carefully brush soil away from fragile bones. Each skeleton is mapped, photographed, and cataloged. Samples are taken from teeth and femurs, then transported to laboratories where sterile rooms protect against contamination. There, geneticists work meticulously to extract fragments of DNA, amplify them, and sequence them. The process is slow, delicate, and astonishing. What emerges is not only the genome of a bacterium, but also the biography of a victim, their ancestry, their diet, their origins. From isotopic analysis of teeth, we can learn where a person grew up, what kind of water they drank, what foods sustained them. From bone injuries, we glimpse their struggles, their labor, their pain. In this way, the mass graves are not silent after all. They are archives, storing human stories that can only now be read. Yet there is a haunting quality to these discoveries. To hold in one's hand the tooth of a person who lived and died nearly 7 centuries ago, to know that within it lies the code of both their life and their killer, is to feel the thinness of the veil between past and present. The Black Death may seem distant, but its genetic legacy flows still in the veins of modern people. We carry in our DNA the echoes of those who lay in those pits. Their survival, or their death, shaped us. One cannot help but wonder at the irony. In their time, these people were discarded hurriedly into the earth, stripped of individuality by the overwhelming numbers of the dead. In our time, they are resurrected through science, becoming unique again, their identities partially restored through genetics. The plague pits, once symbols of hopelessness, have become sources of knowledge that may one day help us survive future pandemics. The silent graves of Europe remind us of the fragility of human life, the speed with which normalcy can collapse, and the enduring power of DNA to carry memory across centuries. They are not merely holes in the ground. They are portals connecting us to the fear, the suffering, and the resilience of our ancestors. And so, as we walk among these excavated bones, brushing away centuries of soil, we listen carefully. For in the quiet of the mass graves, the story of the Black Death still speaks, not in screams of terror, but in whispers of bone and gene, telling us how death once conquered, and how, in some, life endured. The story of the Black Death does not end in the grave. In many ways, it begins there. For beneath the soil, inside the enamel of teeth and the dense walls of bones, a hidden record was preserved, a molecular diary written not in ink, but in the alphabet of life itself, DNA. Centuries after the last victims of the plague were buried, scientists learned to read this diary. What they uncovered was more than history. It was the voice of the past, whispering through molecules, telling us why some lived, why others perished, and how humanity itself was changed forever. But retrieving this voice is not easy. Ancient DNA is fragile, fragmented, and elusive. Over time, heat, water, and microbes gnaw away at it, breaking long genetic chains into short, tattered scraps. Imagine a library where every book has been shredded into confetti, where pages are torn, words are smeared, and sentences are scattered. That is what ancient DNA looks like to a scientist. The task is to reassemble those fragments into a coherent text, to make sense of whispers lost to time. The best preserved DNA often comes from teeth. The enamel, the hardest substance in the human body, forms a protective casing that seals blood vessels and tissues deep within. When a person is infected with Yersinia pestis, the bacteria circulate in their blood, sometimes lodging inside the pulp of their teeth. Long after the flesh decays, the tooth remains, holding within it both the DNA of the victim and the DNA of the pathogen that killed them. In the laboratory, these teeth become time capsules, tiny archives of a tragedy centuries old. The process of recovering ancient DNA begins with excavation. Archaeologists carefully remove teeth and bones, wrapping them to prevent contamination. The greatest danger is not decay, but intrusion. Modern DNA, from a digger's hand, a scientist's breath, or even a speck of dust, can overwhelm the faint signals of the ancient sample. To guard against this, laboratories are built like sanctuaries. Air is filtered, surfaces sterilized, scientists wear full protective suits, masks, and gloves. Every movement is slow, deliberate, ritualistic. It is almost like entering a sacred space where the past must be approached with reverence. Inside the lab, the tooth is first cleaned, then drilled. A fine powder is extracted from the pulp cavity. This powder, invisible to the naked eye, contains fragments of DNA. These fragments are then bathed in chemicals that release their molecular secrets. What emerges is not long, elegant strands of life's code, but tiny, broken snippets, mere shadows of the original. Here begins the real challenge, turning fragments into a story. Ancient DNA sequencing requires techniques far beyond ordinary biology. In the 1980s, scientists first used PCR, polymerase chain reaction, to amplify small fragments, making enough copies to study. But PCR could only capture short regions, and contamination often drowned out the signal. The true revolution came with next-generation sequencing in the 21st century. These technologies allow millions of fragments to be read at once, producing mountains of data that computers then assemble like a puzzle. Imagine a puzzle with 1 million pieces, most of them damaged, many of them missing, some belonging to other puzzles entirely. This is what ancient DNA analysis feels like. Computers compare the fragments to reference genomes, searching for overlaps, aligning letters, and slowly reconstructing the original sequence. The result, if successful, is the genome of a bacterium, or even of the human host, brought back from oblivion. When scientists first reconstructed the genome of Yersinia pestis from plague victims at East Smithfield in London, it was a revelation. For the first time, they could compare the medieval killer to modern strains. They discovered that the Black Death strain was almost identical to those still present today in rodents across Asia and Africa. The implication was chilling. The killer had not disappeared. It still lurked in nature, capable of returning. But they also saw how the pathogen evolved, how subtle genetic changes shaped its virulence, and how it interacted with human hosts. Beyond the bacterium, the human DNA told another story. By comparing the genomes of plague victims with the genomes of people who survived, researchers identified specific genes that influenced immunity. One, ERAP2, stood out. Variants of this gene helped white blood cells recognize and destroy infected cells. Those who carried the protective version were more likely to survive. Those who did not were more likely to perish. Natural selection had spoken, choosing which lines would continue and which would end. It is humbling to realize that we, the living, carry the echoes of that choice. Many Europeans today still bear the ERAP2 mutation, a genetic scar from the 14th century. It is as if the Black Death reached across time, editing the genetic library of humanity. But, as with all edits, there was a cost. The same mutation that protected against plague also increases the risk of autoimmune diseases today: Crohn's disease, rheumatoid arthritis, inflammatory disorders. In escaping one fate, humanity opened the door to another. Such is the paradox of evolution. The work of turning bone into data has reshaped history. Where chronicles told stories of horror, DNA provides proof. Where memory faded, molecules preserved. The plague pits are no longer only symbols of despair. They are archives, yielding information that changes how we understand ourselves. But there is also something profoundly philosophical about this process. To take a tooth from a grave, to extract a powder invisible to the eye, and to transform it into streams of digital letters on a computer screen, it is almost like conjuring ghosts. The dead return, not in flesh, but in data. Their lives, their struggles, their biology, live again in the knowledge we gain. And so, from bone to data, from dust to code, the story of the Black Death continues. In every sequence of DNA, in every line of A, T, C, and G, lies a fragment of the past. The scientists who piece these fragments together are, in a sense, storytellers too. They take the whispers of the dead and weave them into a narrative that spans centuries. In the next part of our journey, we will step deeper into this narrative. Having learned how ancient DNA is recovered, we will now look closely at the genome of Yersinia pestis itself. What did the bacterium look like in the 14th century? How did it evolve? And what can its DNA tell us about the storm it unleashed upon the world? The answers, as always, are waiting in the code. The double helix is one of the most haunting shapes in science. Two spiraling strands intertwined, carrying within them the instructions for life. For centuries, the victims of the Black Death lay silent in their graves, but their bones still held fragments of this spiral, the twisted code of both the human who perished and the bacterium that killed them. It was only in recent decades that scientists learned to read it, to peer directly into the genome of Yersinia pestis, the invisible enemy that reshaped the course of human history. When the first genomes of the plague bacterium were reconstructed from medieval skeletons, it was like opening a time capsule. In laboratories across Europe, teams carefully sequenced DNA from the teeth of plague victims, then compared those sequences to modern strains of Yersinia pestis. What they found was both surprising and unsettling. The medieval strain, the one that killed tens of millions in the 14th century, was almost identical to the strains that still exist today in the burrows of rodents across the globe. This discovery shattered a myth. For years, some had speculated that the Black Death was caused by a more virulent, long-extinct version of the bacterium, one that had burned itself out. But the DNA said otherwise. The killer had not vanished. It was still here. The same pathogen that felled half of Europe's population still lurks in the soil of Asia, Africa, and even parts of the Americas. The difference lies not in the bacterium alone, but in the world around it. Modern sanitation, antibiotics, and medicine have blunted its edge, but the genetic blueprint is nearly unchanged. And yet, there were differences, tiny mutations, subtle shifts in the code. Scientists found genes in the medieval strain that influenced the bacterium's ability to invade the bloodstream and to resist the immune system. One such gene, known as PLA, produces an enzyme that allows Yersinia pestis to break down protective barriers in the human body, helping it spread from lymph nodes into the lungs. This gene was present in the medieval strain, a molecular key that unlocked the deadliest form of plague, pneumonic, the version that spread from person to person in a breath, and that killed almost every victim. The genome also revealed the bacterium's remarkable adaptability. Unlike many pathogens that specialize in one host, Yersinia pestis moves fluidly between species, rodents, fleas, and humans. Its DNA carries instructions for surviving in the gut of a flea, for clinging to the fur of a rat, and for multiplying explosively in human blood. It is not a delicate parasite, but a versatile predator. This flexibility explains how it could leap from the burrows of marmots in Central Asia to the crowded streets of Florence, Genoa, and London. What the genome showed most clearly was the raw efficiency of this organism. It was not magic. It was not divine wrath. It was a bacterium perfectly equipped to exploit the conditions of medieval Europe: dense cities, poor sanitation, widespread malnutrition, and constant trade. In that environment, its genetic toolkit made it unstoppable. One of the most haunting aspects of decoding the plague genome is the realization that this killer is still with us. Outbreaks of plague continue today, in Madagascar, in Congo, in the American Southwest. Each time, doctors treat it quickly with antibiotics, and outbreaks fade. But in the 14th century, no such treatments existed. The DNA sequence is nearly the same, but the world is different. Humanity is different. What was once apocalypse is now, with the tools of science, a curable infection. But the genome also tells us about evolution, not only of the bacterium, but of ourselves. By comparing the DNA of victims with that of survivors, researchers traced how the plague shaped the genetic landscape of Europe. Certain immune system genes show signs of rapid change, as if the Black Death had reached into the double helix and twisted it, selecting for mutations that gave even a slim chance of survival. This is natural selection not in theory, but in brutal practice. Those who carried helpful mutations lived to pass them on. Those who did not vanished. It is sobering to think that the genetic risks we carry today, our susceptibility to autoimmune diseases, our predispositions to certain conditions, may be echoes of that ancient struggle. The genome of Yersinia pestis is thus a mirror, reflecting not only the nature of the killer, but the scars it carved into human DNA. The decoding of the plague genome also taught science a new lesson. The past is not lost. For so long, history seemed limited to chronicles and ruins. But DNA has added a new archive. Every bone, every tooth, is a library of letters, A, T, C, G, waiting to be read. From these letters, entire stories emerge. About microbes, about survival, about the shared destiny of humans and pathogens. And so, in quiet laboratories lit by the glow of sequencing machines, the plague speaks again. Not with screams or cries, but with strings of letters scrolling across computer screens. Scientists lean closer, deciphering, learning, piecing together the code of death. Each discovery reminds us that history is not static. It lives within us, written in our cells, waiting to be uncovered. To listen to the genome of the plague is to hear both terror and triumph. Terror in the reminder of how fragile human societies can be. Triumph in the realization that we can now understand what once seemed inexplicable. The code that killed millions can be read, studied, and used to prepare for the future. In the next chapter of our journey, we will turn our gaze not only to the bacterium, but to the human survivors. For the plague genome is only half the story. The other half lies in the people who lived through it, in the genetic keys that shielded them, however imperfectly, from death. From tragedy arose resilience, and from despair, adaptation. DNA does not only record loss, it also records endurance. And that, perhaps, is the most haunting message of all. The Black Death was more than a catastrophe. It was also an experiment, an unthinkable, brutal experiment carried out not by human intention, but by nature itself. In the mid-14th century, tens of millions perished. But not everyone. Some survived, and in their survival lay clues that would remain hidden for centuries until the language of DNA allowed us to read them. The story of survival begins deep inside the human body, in the silent battles fought by the immune system. Every second of every day, our cells stand guard, scanning for intruders. Bacteria, viruses, parasites, these are the enemy. When an invader enters, the immune system must recognize it as foreign, attack it, and destroy it before it overwhelms the body. This recognition is not simple. It is like a security system in which every cell must decide, is this me or is this not me? One of the key players in this system is a family of proteins known as antigen processors. Their job is to chop up proteins from invading microbes into tiny fragments, pieces small enough to be displayed on the surface of cells. Once displayed, these fragments act like warning flags, signals that shout to immune cells, "Here is the enemy. Attack." Without this process, the immune system may not recognize the invader in time. This is where the gene ERAP2 comes in. Its full name is endoplasmic reticulum aminopeptidase 2. Though the name is long and technical, its role is simple and vital. ERAP2 is like a pair of scissors inside our cells. It cuts protein fragments to the perfect size for display on the cell's surface. Without these scissors, the warning flags may be too long, too short, or absent altogether. With them, the immune system sees clearly and can respond with speed and precision. During the Black Death, this difference between clear recognition and confusion meant life or death. Studies of DNA from plague victims' bones revealed a striking pattern. People who carried a particular variant of ERAP2 were far more likely to survive. Their immune systems recognized Yersinia pestis quickly, attacked it aggressively, and sometimes overcame the infection. Those without the protective variant were at a disadvantage. Their immune response was delayed, clumsy, ineffective. For them, the plague's progress was swift and lethal. Imagine two villagers in medieval London. Both are bitten by fleas carrying the bacterium. In one, the ERAP2 variant functions efficiently. As soon as the bacteria multiply, the scissors begin their work, cutting antigens into perfect pieces. Immune cells swarm to the fight. Perhaps the villager still suffers. The fever, the swelling, the pain. But somehow, against the odds, they survive. In the other villager, the scissors do not work as well. The immune system lags behind. By the time it recognizes the invader, it is too late. Within days, the villager is dead. This is the power of a single gene. Not destiny, not certainty, but a difference in probability, a shift in the odds of survival. When the plague swept across Europe, the odds mattered. Entire populations were subjected to a ruthless filter. Those with protective genes lived longer, reproduced, and passed those genes to their children. Those without did not. Natural selection, normally a slow and subtle force, acted with brutal speed. Centuries later, when scientists sequenced the DNA of thousands of modern Europeans, they saw the signature of this selection. The protective ERAP2 variant was far more common in Europe than in regions untouched by the Black Death. The plague had left a footprint in the genome, reshaping human evolution. But survival came with a price. The ERAP2 variant that sharpened immune responses against plague also sharpened them too much in other contexts. A hypervigilant immune system can mistake the body's own tissues for enemies. This is the essence of autoimmune disease. People with the protective ERAP2 variant are more likely to develop conditions such as Crohn's disease and rheumatoid arthritis, diseases where the body turns against itself. What saved ancestors from plague may condemn descendants to chronic illness. This paradox is at the heart of evolution. There is no perfect solution, only trade-offs. In the 14th century, the benefit of surviving the plague outweighed the distant risk of autoimmune disorders. But today, in a world without epidemic plague, we still live with the consequences of that ancient choice. Our immune systems, shaped by the terror of the Black Death, still carry both its gifts and its burdens. The study of ERAP2 also changes how we think about history. The Black Death was not just a social, cultural, or economic disaster. It was a genetic event. It rewrote the DNA of Europe. In the silent language of nucleotides, A, T, C, and G, it altered the future of generations. Those letters became an inheritance. shaping who would be more resistant to certain infections, who might be more prone to inflammation, who we are today. It is haunting to think that inside each of us may lie echoes of those 14th century battles. When our immune cells spring into action, when they mount a response to a flu virus or a bacterial infection, they may be using tools honed by the plague. When someone struggles with an autoimmune disease, they may be paying the cost of survival chosen centuries ago. The past lives on, not only in memory, but in biology. In telling this story, we also glimpse the deeper rhythm of evolution. Catastrophes shape species, extinctions prune the tree of life, pandemics sculpt genomes. We often think of history as wars, kings, discoveries. But the truest history is molecular, written in the survival of some genes and the disappearance of others. The Black Death was not only a human tragedy, it was also a genetic turning point. The ERAP2 story also offers a glimpse into the future. By understanding how genes influence immunity, we may learn why some people today are more resistant to infections like HIV or COVID-19, while others are more vulnerable. We may design medicines that mimic the protective effects of ERAP2 without triggering autoimmune costs. Ancient DNA is not only about the past, it is a guidebook for the challenges to come. And so, the graves of plague victims have given us more than sorrow. They have given us knowledge, insight, even hope. The victims could not know that their DNA would be studied centuries later. They could not know that their suffering would illuminate the path of science. Yet here we are, reading their genomes, finding answers in their bones, learning how humanity survived one of its darkest hours. To lie in a plague pit was to vanish into anonymity. But through ERAP2, through the molecular scars of survival, their legacy continues. Each of us carries a history written in blood and gene. Each of us is the outcome of ancient battles fought in the invisible world of microbes and immunity. And so, the story of ERAP2 is not just about a gene. It is about resilience. It is about the extraordinary ways in which life endures, even in the face of overwhelming death. It is about the truth that within tragedy lies adaptation, and within adaptation, the seeds of future life. The Black Death ended many lives, but it also shaped the lives that came after. ERAP2 is one reminder, subtle, molecular, enduring, that DNA remembers. In the next chapter, we will explore the cost of this survival more deeply. For while ERAP2 gave life to some, it also planted new vulnerabilities in humanity's future. This is the paradox of survival. Every gift carries a shadow. Survival is never free. In the great ledger of evolution, every advantage comes with a cost. The Black Death carved this truth into the human genome, and the gene ERAP2 is perhaps its clearest example. In the 14th century, it offered protection, helping some survive a disease that annihilated nearly half of Europe. But centuries later, the very same genetic gift became a burden, increasing the risk of other illnesses. Diseases born not of foreign invaders, but of the body's own defenses turning against itself. This is the paradox of survival. To escape one death is often to invite another. To understand this cost, we must first revisit the immune system. In its essence, the immune system is a guardian, a vigilant army patrolling the body. It must distinguish friend from foe, self from non-self. When bacteria or viruses enter, the immune system recognizes them, attacks them, and remembers them for the future. Yet this recognition must be exquisitely precise. If the line blurs, if the immune system mistakes its own tissues for invaders, it begins to wage war on the self. This betrayal of the body by its defenders is what we call autoimmunity. The ERAP2 gene, so effective in sharpening immune recognition during the plague, also sharpens the risk of such betrayals. By cutting microbial proteins into neat fragments, ERAP2 ensured that immune cells could identify Yersinia pestis swiftly and respond with force. But the same mechanism, when overactive or misdirected, can also create fragments from the body's own proteins, fragments that resemble invaders. The immune system, unable to tell the difference, attacks its own tissues. The result is chronic inflammation, pain, and disease. One of the clearest examples is Crohn's disease, a chronic disorder of the digestive tract. In Crohn's, the immune system mistakenly identifies the gut as hostile territory. It sends wave after wave of immune cells into the intestines, where they unleash inflammation that erodes the lining, causes ulcers, and produces agonizing pain. Patients suffer diarrhea, weight loss, malnutrition, and fatigue. Research has shown that individuals carrying the plague-protective ERAP2 variant are more likely to develop Crohn's disease. What saved their ancestors from infection may doom their descendants to a lifetime of inflammation. Another is rheumatoid arthritis, a disease in which the immune system targets the joints. Here, too, ERAP2's efficiency may turn against the body, presenting fragments of joint proteins in ways that trigger attack. The result is swelling, stiffness, and the gradual destruction of cartilage and bone. In medieval Europe, ERAP2 may have meant the difference between death and survival. In modern Europe, it sometimes means decades of pain. Even more haunting is the connection to lupus, an autoimmune condition that can strike the skin, kidneys, heart, and brain. Lupus is often called the great imitator because its symptoms vary so widely: rashes, fevers, fatigue, organ damage. Studies have hinted at ERAP2's involvement, its hyperactive antigen processing nudging the immune system toward confusion. To live with lupus is to live in constant uncertainty, never knowing when the body will betray itself. These diseases are not minor inconveniences. They shape lives, families, and societies. Patients endure not only physical suffering but also emotional weight, the knowledge that their own defenses are their tormentors. And yet, when viewed through the lens of history, they are the shadows of survival. Without the ERAP2 variant, their ancestors might never have lived to pass on any genes at all. This is the cruel logic of natural selection. It does not plan. It does not foresee. It selects for survival in the present, not for well-being in the future. During the plague, the ERAP2 mutation saved lives. That was enough. Evolution cared nothing for what might happen 6 centuries later. And so the mutation spread, leaving descendants who bear both its gift and its curse. Science has only recently illuminated this trade-off. By comparing the genomes of thousands of modern patients with autoimmune disease to ancient DNA from plague victims, researchers found the link. The same variant enriched in survivors of the Black Death is enriched in patients with Crohn's and rheumatoid arthritis today. The connection is direct, written clearly in the double helix: survival in one era, suffering in another. There is a strange comfort in this knowledge. For patients struggling with autoimmune disease, their pain is no longer just random misfortune. It is part of a larger story, a story of ancestors who endured one of humanity's darkest hours. Their bodies carry the evidence of survival, even if it comes with hidden costs. It is as if their illness is not only a burden, but also a reminder. Your ancestors lived when others did not. Your existence is proof of their endurance. Yet this does not lessen the tragedy. The price of survival is often borne by the innocent. Those who carry ERAP2's burden today never chose it. They inherit it just as they inherit eye color or height. Evolution's ledger is indifferent to fairness. It only records outcomes. The paradox also challenges our view of health. We often imagine genes as either good or bad, beneficial or harmful. But the story of ERAP2 reveals a deeper truth. Context matters. In one environment, a gene is salvation. In another, it is suffering. Genes do not carry permanent labels. They are tools, shaped by the circumstances in which they are used. The Black Death made ERAP2's efficiency a gift. The modern world, free of plague but plagued by inflammation, makes it a burden. For science, this realization opens doors. By studying how ERAP2 sharpened immune responses in the past, we may learn to design therapies that mimic its protective effects against infection, while avoiding its autoimmune consequences. Ancient DNA is not only a record of what was, it is also a guide to what might be. By listening to the genetic echoes of the Black Death, we may find ways to protect ourselves from diseases yet to come. There is a philosophical lesson too. The Black Death was not just an event in history books. It still lives within us. It shaped who we are at the most intimate level, our DNA. Each of us is a mosaic of past victories and past wounds. We carry the legacy of ancestors who survived famine, plague, and war. And sometimes, that legacy weighs heavily. To live with an autoimmune disease is to carry both survival and sacrifice in one body. Picture for a moment a medieval villager in 1348, lying feverish in a darkened cottage. Their family weeps, expecting the worst. But somehow, their body rallies. Their immune system fights back, aided by ERAP2. Against the odds, they survive. They live to have children, who have children, until, centuries later, their bloodline leads to someone living today. That descendant may sit in a hospital waiting room, struggling with Crohn's disease or arthritis, unaware that their illness is the echo of survival in a time of plague. Past and present, victory and cost are inseparable. The mass graves of the Black Death are filled with those who did not carry protective genes. But the streets outside, the descendants who walk them today, are shaped by those who did. The world we know exists because some lived, and because survival came at a price. In the end, ERAP2's story is not unique. Many genetic traits carry such paradoxes. The gene that protects against malaria, for example, also causes sickle cell disease when inherited in 2 copies. The gene that aids in digesting milk opened new diets for humanity, but also brought intolerance for many. Every adaptation is a gamble, every mutation a coin with 2 faces. Evolution writes history in compromises, and so the Black Death teaches us that survival is never simple. It is not pure triumph. It is triumph laced with cost, endurance shadowed by consequence. Our DNA is a ledger filled with such bargains. Some saved us, some continue to haunt us. All define us. In the next part of our story, we will step back and look at this process not just through one gene, but through the broader lens of natural selection. The Black Death was not only a medical catastrophe, it was an evolutionary crucible, a moment when nature reshaped humanity itself. What we call tragedy, nature calls adaptation, and the lessons of that adaptation still live within us today. In the vast story of life on Earth, evolution is often slow. Mutations appear quietly, spreading or fading over generations. Natural selection works at a pace almost invisible, shaping species through the gentle pressure of environment and time. But sometimes, history delivers a catastrophe, a firestorm so intense that it accelerates this process, forcing change not in millennia, but in decades. The Black Death was one of those firestorms. It was not only a tragedy, it was an evolutionary crucible, reshaping humanity under the shadow of death. To see how, we must remember what natural selection is. Charles Darwin would not publish his ideas until the 19th century, long after the plague, but the principle was already at work in every organism. In its simplest form, natural selection means this: traits that help survival tend to be passed on. Traits that hinder survival tend to disappear. Over time, this quiet filtering alters the makeup of a population. It is not conscious, not purposeful. It is simply the mathematics of life and death. During the Black Death, this mathematics became stark. Tens of millions across Europe were infected. Most perished, but some lived, and those who lived were not chosen randomly. They carried certain biological advantages, some visible, some hidden in their DNA. A stronger immune response, a genetic mutation like ERAP2, perhaps even subtle differences in metabolism or blood chemistry. These invisible shields tipped the scales ever so slightly toward survival. Because the death toll was so enormous, wiping out perhaps 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population, the effect of this filtering was profound. Imagine a village of 200 people. The plague arrives, and within weeks, only 100 remain. If 20 of those survivors happen to carry a protective genetic variant, that variant suddenly becomes far more common in the community. Their children inherit it. Within just a few generations, a gene that was once rare can spread widely. This is natural selection sped up by catastrophe. Genetic studies confirm this. By comparing ancient DNA from plague victims with DNA from modern Europeans, scientists see signals of selection. Immune-related genes show signs of having been swept by the plague. Variants that enhanced defense against infection increased in frequency. Variants that offered no protection dwindled. The Black Death was not just a wave of mortality. It was a genetic bottleneck, squeezing humanity through a narrow gate and changing what emerged on the other side. The scale of this event is staggering. The Black Death did not strike one village, one nation, or even one continent alone. It swept across Eurasia and North Africa, killing with such uniform ferocity that entire regions were reshaped. In England, whole villages were abandoned. In Italy, family lines ended overnight. In France, fields lay fallow as peasants perished. Every death was a tragedy, but together they became a force of selection, like the hand of nature redrawing the human genome. The signs of this reshaping are visible even today. European populations carry higher frequencies of certain immune variants compared to populations that were less affected by the plague. These differences influence how people respond to infections, how they process inflammation, and even how they experience autoimmune disease. The shadow of the Black Death still stretches across the immune systems of its descendants. But natural selection is not mercy. It is not kindness. It is simply survival. Those who lived were not better in any moral sense. They were simply more compatible with the challenge of their time. The plague cared nothing for virtue, wealth, or piety. Priests and peasants, kings and beggars, it struck all alike. Only biology tilted the balance, and biology, indifferent and relentless, chose who continued and who did not. It is important to recognize that evolution does not always produce perfection. It produces trade-offs. A gene that once protected against plague may now predispose us to autoimmune disease. A mutation that helped one environment may harm in another. The legacy of the Black Death is thus complex. It gave humanity resilience against one enemy, but it also seeded vulnerabilities that echo in modern health. Evolution writes in compromises, not in absolutes. There is a philosophical weight to this realization. We often think of history as wars, kings, and revolutions, but perhaps the most enduring revolutions are molecular. While Europe mourned its dead, while artists painted macabre visions of skeletons dancing, nature was quietly rewriting the script of humanity at the level of DNA. The survivors were not only witnesses, they were carriers of a new genetic future. Imagine again a small medieval family, the father, the mother, 2 children. The plague takes the mother and 1 child. The father and daughter survive. Why? Perhaps the daughter inherited a particular variant of ERAP2. Perhaps her immune system was primed in some subtle way. She grows, she has children, and centuries later, her descendants walk among us. Without her survival, an entire branch of the human story would vanish. Multiply this by millions of families, millions of hidden genetic lotteries, and you see how a continent's DNA could be reshaped in a single generation. The Black Death also changed behavior, culture, and society, and these changes too interacted with evolution. With fewer people alive, survivors had greater access to resources. They ate better, lived longer, and raised more children. Genes of the survivors spread not only because of biology, but also because of opportunity. Evolution is never isolated. It dances with environment, culture, and chance. Modern geneticists sometimes call events like the Black Death selective sweeps. A powerful pressure eliminates huge portions of a population, allowing certain variants to sweep through the survivors. Usually, these sweeps take centuries or millennia. In the plague, it happened in decades. Few other events in human history rival its speed and scale. And yet, we must be cautious. Not all survival was genetic. Some lived by chance, those who avoided exposure, those who fled to less affected regions, those whose communities practiced effective quarantine. Biology is only part of the story. But in the great tide of mortality, biology mattered. It left fingerprints in DNA that cannot be explained by chance alone. The lessons of this evolutionary crucible extend beyond history. They remind us that humanity is not fixed. We are still evolving, shaped by diseases, diets, and environments. Just as plague altered genomes in the 14th century, modern pandemics may alter them now. The story continues. Natural selection in the age of plague was merciless, but it was also creative. Out of devastation emerged resilience. Out of mass death emerged a new balance of life. The survivors were not chosen in any conscious sense, but their descendants carry the mark of that selection. We, listening to this story tonight, may carry in ourselves the legacy of choices made not by us, but by a bacterium, by an invisible killer that once stalked our ancestors. As we drift deeper into this narrative, let us pause. The Black Death was not only a historical catastrophe, it was also an evolutionary moment, a chapter written in both bone and blood, in both sorrow and survival. Natural selection worked swiftly under its shadow, changing humanity in ways we still live with today. In the next part of our story, we will look beyond genes and evolution to the societies that endured. For evolution is not only biological, it is also cultural. The Black Death did not merely rewrite DNA, it rewrote history. The Black Death was not only a storm of death, it was also a collapse, a shattering of numbers so vast that Europe itself seemed to empty. Between 1347 and 1351, in just 4 years, the continent lost perhaps 50 million souls, nearly half its people. It is almost impossible to imagine. Streets once crowded with markets fell silent. Villages stood deserted, their fields untended. Churches rang their bells not for weddings or feasts, but endlessly for funerals. The collapse was not just demographic. It was cultural, economic, and genetic. Humanity itself was reshaped by the sudden absence of so many. Let us first look at the scale. Before the plague, Europe's population had grown steadily for centuries. By the early 14th century, estimates place it at around 80 to 100 million. Cities were swelling, trade flourished, farmland expanded. But the plague cut through this abundance with terrifying speed. In Florence, chroniclers wrote of streets so empty that grass grew between the stones. In Paris, corpses piled in churchyards until they spilled into open fields. In London, half the population vanished. Across rural England, entire hamlets disappeared from maps. In Germany, the Rhineland lost towns overnight. The silence was everywhere. This collapse created what biologists call a genetic bottleneck. When a population shrinks suddenly and dramatically, the genetic diversity of that population shrinks with it. Imagine a jar filled with colored marbles, each color representing a different genetic variant. If you pour out half the jar at random, some colors disappear, others become more common simply by chance. If the marbles you keep are those with traits that aid survival, then those traits will dominate in future generations. The Black Death was this jar tipped over, its marbles spilling onto the ground, leaving only a fraction behind. The consequences of such a bottleneck are profound. Genes once rare became widespread. Variants that had little impact before became defining features of the population. And because the Black Death killed selectively, more often those without certain protective mutations, the survivors' descendants carried genomes subtly but permanently altered. Modern studies confirm this. By examining DNA from skeletons buried before and after the plague, scientists see shifts in allele frequencies, tiny changes in the percentage of people carrying certain genetic variants. These shifts are the fingerprints of natural selection, visible centuries later. The collapse also reshaped families and lineages. Entire dynasties ended abruptly. Family trees were pruned with brutal efficiency. In many villages, surnames vanished forever, carried away by death. But for those who survived, opportunities expanded. With fewer people, survivors inherited more land, more wealth, more choice in marriage. Their children were more likely to grow up well-fed, healthy, and strong. Thus, the genetic impact was compounded by social change. Survival was rewarded twice, by biology and by circumstance. Consider the story of rural England. After the plague, vast tracts of farmland lay idle. Labor was scarce. Peasants who survived could demand higher wages, better conditions, even mobility once denied them. For centuries, serfdom had bound them to the soil. After the plague, many broke free. The social contract of feudalism cracked, reshaping society. But the genetic story moved in parallel. Well-fed peasants bore more children, passing their genes more widely. Malnutrition, once common, receded for a time. In their bodies, resilience spread. In cities, the aftermath was equally striking. With fewer citizens, some urban centers shrank into shadows of their former selves. Others rebounded with new vigor, fueled by survivors who inherited businesses, houses, and workshops. These survivors carried not only the legacy of plague resistance, but also the cultural energy to rebuild. In their DNA and in their deeds, they planted the seeds of Europe's future. Some historians argue that the Renaissance itself was, in part, born from this strange mixture of tragedy and renewal, a society emptied, but then enriched by survivors who thrived in its wake. But bottlenecks also carry dangers. With reduced diversity, populations become more vulnerable to new diseases. When genetic variety narrows, the range of immune responses narrows too. A virus or bacterium that can evade one immune type may find many more hosts to infect. The Black Death, while it sharpened certain defenses, may also have left other vulnerabilities. We see hints of this in the spread of later epidemics, influenza, syphilis, and tuberculosis. Each found fertile ground in populations already sculpted by plague. Even today, the genetic aftermath is visible. Certain immune system genes are more common in Europe than elsewhere, likely due to plague-driven selection. These genes influence how Europeans respond to infection, to vaccines, even to inflammation. They may partly explain differences in disease susceptibility across populations. The collapse of the 14th century still echoes in hospitals today, in how bodies respond to microbes. There is a haunting irony here. The Black Death destroyed half of Europe, but in doing so, it also reshaped the half that remained. Those who lived were not only survivors, they were founders of a new genetic Europe. Their descendants inherited both the gift of resilience and the burden of trade-offs. They became, in a sense, a new people, not outwardly different, but inwardly altered, their genomes carrying scars of the catastrophe. This truth deepens our understanding of history. We often speak of the Black Death in terms of suffering, art, economics, and faith. But beneath all these layers lies the molecular story. Every abandoned village, every silent churchyard, is also a record of genetic filtering. Evolution was at work in real time, pruning and selecting, shaping and redirecting. The population collapse was not merely an end. It was also a beginning. It is humbling to reflect on this. Each of us alive today is the product of countless such filters, famines, plagues, wars, that chose which lineages continued and which ended. We carry within us the survivors of 1,000 catastrophes. The Black Death was one of the greatest of these sieves, narrowing humanity, refining it, and sending it forward changed. Imagine standing in a quiet European field where a village once stood, now vanished since the 14th century. Beneath the soil lie the bones of those who perished. They did not know that their deaths would shape the DNA of future generations. They only knew fear and loss, and yet their absence, their silence, became part of the genetic fabric of those who lived on. The collapse wrote itself into the genome, and the genome carried it forward. The aftermath of this collapse was not simply fewer people. It was different people, genetically tuned by catastrophe. They rebuilt villages, replanted fields, and repopulated cities, but they did so with genomes forever altered, carrying the imprint of survival through plague. The Europe that emerged after 1351 was not the same Europe that had entered 1347. It was a continent reduced in number, but reshaped in essence. This is the paradox of the Black Death's legacy. It was devastation, but also transformation. It emptied, but it also refined. It ended, but it also began. And in the code of DNA, in the inheritance of immunity and vulnerability, it still speaks today. In the next part of our story, we will follow this inheritance further. We will explore how DNA carries not only survival, but also memory, how the very molecules of our bodies remember catastrophes past. For if bones are silent witnesses, DNA is a speaking witness, telling stories across centuries. When we think of memory, we think of the mind, of stories told, of songs sung, of images painted on canvas or carved in stone. But there is another kind of memory, deeper, quieter, more enduring. the memory written in DNA. In the centuries after the Black Death, Europe carried both forms of memory. In its art and culture, it remembered the fear, the loss, the confrontation with death. In its genomes, it remembered the selection, the survival, the genetic scars of catastrophe. Together, these two forms of memory, biological and cultural, shaped what it meant to be human in the aftermath of plague. Let us first consider genetic memory. DNA is not conscious. It does not tell stories in words or images, yet it records survival. Every gene variant that persisted after the Black Death is a testimony, a reminder that someone, somewhere, lived, while others did not. The ERAP2 mutation is one such record, but it is not alone. Other immune system genes also show signs of selection, subtle changes that reveal the plague's imprint. These genes are like fossils, not of bones, but of choices made by nature. They are memories carried not by individuals, but by populations, handed down silently through the generations. Genetic memory is strange because it is invisible. No one feels it. No one knows they carry it. Yet it influences lives every day. It shapes how bodies respond to infections, how they react to vaccines, how they balance immunity and inflammation. In this way, the Black Death whispers still, not in our ears, but in our cells. It whispers every time an immune cell meets a pathogen, every time our bodies decide whether to fight or to tolerate. Parallel to this biological memory was cultural memory, far more visible. Medieval Europe could not forget the Black Death. It scarred the imagination as much as the body. Artists painted the danse macabre, the dance of death, showing skeletons leading kings, peasants, and bishops alike into the grave. Writers described visions of decay and judgment. Churches filled with hymns of mourning, their architecture echoing the obsession with mortality. Even centuries later, the figure of death as a skeletal reaper carrying a scythe traces its origins to this cultural trauma. Cultural memory preserved what genes could not: the emotions, the terrors, the questions. Why had God allowed such suffering? Why had so many died, and why had some been spared? In sermons and plays, people sought meaning. In folk tales and superstitions, they sought explanation. Every community wove its own legends, its own ways of carrying the memory forward. And just as genes were passed from parent to child, so too were these stories passed from one generation to the next. Together, genetic and cultural memory reinforced each other. A child born after the plague carried within their body the genetic legacy of survival. At the same time, they grew up surrounded by stories of the horror their parents had endured. Their blood and their imagination were both marked by the Black Death. The two forms of memory intertwined, shaping both biology and identity. One can see this in the rituals that emerged. Some communities held annual processions of penitence, reminding themselves of the fragility of life. Others built shrines, dedicating them to saints, believed to have offered protection during the plague. These practices carried forward cultural memory, ensuring that the lessons of mortality were not forgotten. And within the very people who enacted these rituals, the DNA of survivors pulsed, ensuring that the biological memory was carried forward as well. This dual memory raises a profound question. What does it mean to remember? Is memory only in the mind, or is it also in the body? If our genomes carry the marks of past catastrophes, then in some sense, our bodies remember, even when our minds do not. And if our art and stories preserve the emotions of the past, then our cultures remember even when our cells cannot. The Black Death ensured that both forms of memory would persist. The resonance of this can be felt even today. In our genes, we still carry the legacy of plague resistance and its autoimmune costs. In our culture, we still invoke the figure of death with a scythe, still tell stories of pestilence and apocalypse. Literature, film, and art return again and again to themes of contagion, survival, and mortality. Each time we do, we echo the medieval memory of the Black Death. It is as though the trauma of the 14th century became a permanent part of what it means to be human, encoded both in nucleotides and in narratives. Consider the Renaissance, which blossomed in the century after the plague. Some historians argue that the confrontation with death fueled a new appetite for life, for art, for knowledge. Survivors sought meaning not only in religion, but in human creativity. The frescoes of Florence, the writings of Petrarch, the rise of humanism, all can be seen as cultural responses to the abyss of the Black Death. While DNA carried forward immunity, culture carried forward inspiration, both born from the same catastrophe. This interplay of genetic and cultural memory is not unique to the Black Death. Every catastrophe leaves traces in both. Famines alter genes related to metabolism, while also generating stories of hunger. Wars select for resilience and spread myths of heroism. Pandemics adjust immune systems and inspire poems of mourning. Humanity is shaped as much by what it endures as by what it creates in response. The Black Death was simply one of the most dramatic examples, a catastrophe so vast that both our bodies and our imaginations are still haunted by it. As we drift deeper into this reflection, consider your own body. Hidden in your cells are the molecular signatures of ancestors who survived. In your culture, your language, your art, your religion, are the echoes of how they made sense of survival. You are the intersection of these two memories, living proof that catastrophe does not end a story, but transforms it. In the quiet of night, when the world is still, it is almost possible to hear both. The DNA speaks in silence, in invisible molecules. Culture speaks in words and images, in music and myth. Together, they tell the same truth. The Black Death was not forgotten. It lives on in us. In the next part of our journey, we will compare this catastrophe to others. For the Black Death was not the only pandemic in history. There were others: the Spanish flu, smallpox, and most recently, COVID-19. By comparing their impacts, we can see how different catastrophes leave different imprints, some in DNA, some in culture, some in both. The story continues, always in memory, always in survival. The Black Death was not the first pandemic to scar humanity, nor was it the last. Disease has always walked beside us, sometimes quietly, sometimes with devastating force. To understand the place of the Black Death in the broader human story, we must compare it with other pandemics: the relentless centuries of smallpox, the sudden wave of Spanish flu in 1918, and the still unfolding story of COVID-19. Each was different. Each left its mark. And together, they remind us that humanity is forever shaped by its encounters with invisible enemies. Let us begin with smallpox. Unlike the sudden explosion of the Black Death, smallpox was a slow-burning terror, present for thousands of years. Ancient Egyptian mummies show scars of its pustules. Throughout history, it killed kings and peasants alike. In the 17th and 18th centuries, smallpox became perhaps the deadliest disease on Earth, killing hundreds of millions. Its symptoms were unmistakable: fever, rash, and then the eruption of pus-filled blisters across the skin. Those who survived were often left with deep, permanent scars, a visible reminder etched on the body. Others were blinded. Unlike plague, which came in waves, Smallpox was constant, endemic, always lurking. The genetic impact of smallpox is harder to trace than plague, but scientists suspect it shaped immunity in regions where it raged for centuries. Populations exposed repeatedly developed higher frequencies of immune variants that aided resistance. But the cultural impact was undeniable. Smallpox inspired fear, superstition, and eventually one of humanity's greatest triumphs, vaccination. Edward Jenner's discovery in 1796 that exposure to cowpox could protect against smallpox was the birth of immunology. In 1980, smallpox became the first disease eradicated by human effort. Unlike plague, it no longer haunts our genes, but its cultural memory is immense. It gave us the concept of vaccines, a gift that protects billions. Next, consider the Spanish flu of 1918. Unlike smallpox, it was sudden, short, and explosive. Emerging in the final months of World War I, the influenza pandemic swept across the globe in waves between 1918 and 1920. It infected perhaps 1/3 of humanity and killed over 50 million people, more than the war itself. Its cruelty lay in its victims. Unlike most flus, which strike hardest at the very young and very old, the Spanish flu killed robust young adults in their 20s and 30s. Soldiers returning from the trenches carried it home, spreading it rapidly through ports, trains, and cities. The images are haunting. Streets lined with coffins, emergency hospitals filling gymnasiums and churches, nurses and doctors wearing crude masks, exhausted from endless work. Families struck down within days. Like plague, Spanish flu overwhelmed societies, but in a world of telegraphs, newspapers, and modern states, its impact was global in an entirely new way. It reshaped demography, economies, and even politics. Some historians argue it influenced the end of the war itself, weakening armies and leaders. Genetically, its impact is less clear. Unlike plague, which acted as a selective bottleneck over several years, influenza killed quickly and broadly, often regardless of genetic background. But it left cultural memory. Survivors carried stories of sudden loss, and literature of the early 20th century is haunted by references to invisible illness and grief. For decades, the Spanish flu was overshadowed by the war in memory, but in recent years, scholars have reclaimed it as one of the great defining catastrophes of the 20th century. Finally, we come to COVID-19, the pandemic of our own age. Emerging in late 2019, the coronavirus spread with astonishing speed through the interconnected world of the 21st century. Planes carried it across continents in days, cities locked down, streets emptied. Masks, once relics of the 1918 pandemic, became daily attire again. Unlike plague or smallpox, COVID-19 unfolded in a world of advanced medicine and digital communication. Scientists sequenced its genome within weeks, developed vaccines within a year, and shared information instantly across borders. Yet despite these tools, the toll was immense. Millions dead, economies disrupted, lives altered. The cultural impact of COVID-19 is still unfolding. It has left us with new rituals of cleanliness, new attitudes toward health, and new anxieties about contact, proximity, and vulnerability. Like plague, it exposed inequalities. Some communities bore the brunt more heavily than others. Like Spanish flu, it reminded us of the fragility of even young and healthy lives. Like smallpox, it has driven innovation in vaccines and public health. What about its genetic impact? This is a question only time will answer. Already, studies suggest that certain genetic variants, particularly those affecting the immune response, may influence susceptibility to severe COVID-19. Some of these variants, intriguingly, trace back to ancient encounters with viruses, perhaps even to the Neanderthals. If COVID-19 lingers or recurs, it may leave its own footprint on the human genome, though likely not as dramatic as the Black Death. But its cultural memory is assured. Generations to come will remember the masks, the lockdowns, the silence of deserted cities. When we compare these pandemics, certain patterns emerge. Each one reveals the same fragile balance: humanity striving to survive, microbes evolving to exploit us, and the interplay between biology and culture. The Black Death reshaped our genes. Smallpox gave us vaccines. Spanish flu taught us the cost of global spread. COVID-19 shows us both our vulnerability and our power, the speed of our science, the slowness of our politics, the resilience of our communities. Together, they form a continuum. Disease is not an aberration in human history. It is a constant companion. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it is catastrophic. Always it leaves traces, in genomes, in cultures, in memories. As we drift through this comparison, the deeper truth becomes clear. Pandemics are not only moments of loss, they are moments of transformation. They alter who we are, how we live, how we remember. The Black Death was perhaps the most dramatic of all, but in the Spanish flu, in smallpox, and in COVID-19, we see the same pattern repeated: humanity tested, humanity scarred, humanity changed. In the next part of our story, we will turn back to the scientific effort to preserve these traces. For pandemics leave not only bones and memories, but also data, DNA that can be stored, sequenced, and studied. The creation of global databases of ancient DNA has opened a new chapter in our understanding of history. Through them, the whispers of the past become voices we can finally hear. Imagine a library, not a library of paper and ink, but of bone and dust, shelves that stretch across continents, filled not with books, but with the remains of those who lived long ago. Each tooth, each fragment of bone, is a volume in this collection. Each carries words not written in language, but in molecules, the 4 letters of DNA, A, T, C, and G. This is the global archive of ancient DNA, and it is changing how we understand human history. The story of this archive begins with technology. For decades, archaeologists uncovered skeletons, but the information they could glean was limited: age, sex, signs of injury, traces of disease. Valuable, but incomplete. The advent of ancient DNA sequencing transformed these remains from silent witnesses into speaking archives. Suddenly, scientists could read genetic codes preserved for hundreds, even thousands of years. They could reconstruct ancestry, identify pathogens, and trace the flow of genes across time and space. But ancient DNA is fragile. It does not survive easily. Heat, water, and microbes destroy it. Only under special conditions, in cold caves, in dry deserts, in dense teeth, does it persist. Even then, it is broken into fragments. Sequencing ancient DNA is like piecing together a book shredded into confetti, smudged, and scattered. Yet with next-generation sequencing, scientists can now assemble these fragments into coherent stories. The scale of this effort has grown rapidly. In the early 2000s, only a handful of ancient genomes were sequenced. Today, thousands are available, and the number is growing every year. Laboratories across Europe, North America, and Asia collaborate to build vast databases. These archives contain not only human DNA, but also DNA of animals, plants, and pathogens. Together, they form a mosaic of past ecosystems, revealing how humans interacted with their environments. Consider what this means for our understanding of pandemics. From plague pits in London scientists have extracted Yersinia pestis genomes, tracing the evolution of the bacterium across centuries. From Siberian permafrost, they have recovered DNA of ancient viruses preserved in ice. From Native American burials, they have sequenced DNA showing how smallpox reshaped populations after European contact. Each genome is a piece of the puzzle. Together, they form a global picture of how disease has shaped humanity. Yet the archive extends beyond disease. Ancient DNA tells stories of migration. It shows how early farmers from the Near East spread into Europe, carrying both crops and genes. It reveals how steppe nomads moved westward, leaving descendants across the continent. It uncovers hidden ancestries, forgotten lineages, and unexpected connections. Where written records are silent, DNA speaks. The ethical questions are profound. To sequence ancient DNA is to disturb the dead. It requires drilling into teeth, extracting powder from bones. Some communities resist, arguing that their ancestors should rest undisturbed. Others see value in the knowledge gained. Scientists now work with strict guidelines, seeking consent from descendant communities, ensuring respectful handling, and balancing curiosity with dignity. The Global Archive is not just a scientific project, it is also a moral one, and yet the potential is immense. Each genome added to the archive enriches the tapestry of human history. Together, they allow us to reconstruct not only the movements of peoples, but also the battles fought within their bodies, battles against plague, tuberculosis, leprosy, malaria. These battles shaped who survived, who thrived, and who left descendants. The DNA archive is not only a record of lives lived, but also of lives lost. The metaphor of a library is apt. Imagine walking down its corridors. On one shelf rests the genome of a Neanderthal, whispering of interbreeding with early modern humans. On another, the genome of a plague victim, still carrying the DNA of Yersinia pestis. Further on, the genome of an ancient farmer, showing how lactose tolerance spread. Each book is incomplete, damaged, but together, they form a collection richer than any written history. The Global Archive also connects disciplines. Archaeologists, geneticists, historians, anthropologists, all must work together to interpret what the genomes mean. A sequence of letters on a screen is only the beginning. To understand it, we must know the context, the site, the artifacts, the culture. DNA alone cannot tell us who a person loved, what they feared, what stories they told by firelight. But combined with archaeology and history, it gives us a fuller picture than ever before. The archive grows daily. New sites are excavated, new skeletons sampled, new genomes sequenced. What was once a handful of data points has become a flood. Soon, we may have tens of thousands of ancient genomes covering every region of the globe. Already, scientists are beginning to map the rise and fall of genetic traits, like lactose tolerance, skin pigmentation, or disease resistance, across millennia. The archive is becoming not just a library, but a time machine. And what of the Black Death? In this library, it occupies a prominent shelf. The genomes of its victims have been sequenced, their pathogens reconstructed, their immune genes analyzed. We know more about this pandemic than about almost any other pre-modern catastrophe. The archive preserves their story in exquisite detail, ensuring that the memory of the plague is carried not only in bones, not only in culture, but in data, digital, enduring, and global. As we drift through this reflection, there is something deeply moving in the idea of a global archive of ancient DNA. It is as if the dead are finally allowed to speak, their silence broken not by voices, but by molecules. They tell us who they were, where they came from, what killed them, and what they left behind. They remind us that history is not only written in books, but also in blood. In the next part of our journey, we will leave the collective and return to the individual. For while the archive is vast, each genome is also a personal story. Each skeleton unearthed is not just data, but a human life, unique and irreplaceable. We will follow one such story from a single body in a plague pit and see what science can learn when it listens closely to one forgotten voice. When we speak of pandemics, we speak in numbers. Millions dead, half of Europe gone, populations collapsed. But behind the numbers are individuals. Every death was a person with a name, a family, a story. Most of these names have been lost. The Black Death was too vast, too sudden for careful records. But the bones remember, and sometimes, through science, we can give one anonymous skeleton back a fragment of their voice. Let us imagine such a skeleton, unearthed in the East Smithfield Plague Pit in London. It lies among hundreds of others, arranged neatly in rows. The burial was hurried but not careless. The dead were stacked side by side, wrapped in shrouds that have long since decayed. Archaeologists gently brush the soil from the bones, noting their condition. One skeleton catches the eye. The teeth are well preserved. The bones are slender. The pelvis reveals this was a young woman, perhaps in her early 20s. Already, her story begins to take shape. She lived in 14th century London, a city of narrow streets, crowded markets, and endless noise. She may have been a daughter, a sister, perhaps a mother. But what more can we know? This is where the science of ancient DNA and isotopes enters, turning fragments into biography. Her teeth are drilled carefully. The powder extracted reveals her genetic code. From her DNA, we learn her ancestry. She carried markers common among medieval English populations, with traces that hint at older migrations from Northern Europe. She was not foreign to London. She belonged to its people. But within her DNA, scientists also find the genetic fingerprint of Yersinia pestis. The bacterium that killed her is still there, 7 centuries later, frozen in molecular form. Her bones tell other stories. The enamel of her teeth contains oxygen isotopes, tiny chemical signatures that record the water she drank as a child. These isotopes match the rivers of southern England, confirming that she grew up near London. Strontium in her bones, absorbed from the soil and food, further narrows the picture. She was local, born and raised. Carbon and nitrogen isotopes provide clues to her diet. The balance of these elements shows she ate mostly bread made from wheat or barley, supplemented by some meat, likely pork or mutton, and occasional fish. This was the diet of a modest but not destitute household. She was not starving. She had access to enough calories to grow to adulthood. But her bones also show signs of stress. Lines across her teeth, called enamel hypoplasia, reveal periods in childhood when malnutrition or illness interrupted her growth. Perhaps a famine year, perhaps a fever. She carried those scars into adulthood. Her skeleton holds more. Slight curvature in her spine suggests heavy labor, perhaps carrying water, working in fields, or hauling goods through crowded streets. Small lesions on her tibia hint at chronic infections, the lingering wounds of a life lived in unsanitary conditions. She was not wealthy. She worked hard. Her body bore the marks, and then came the plague. In her teeth, the DNA of Yersinia pestis confirms her final illness. We cannot know her symptoms with certainty, but we can imagine the sudden fever, the swelling buboes, the pain and delirium. Within days, she was gone. Carried by cart to the plague pit, laid beside hundreds of others, she became part of the great silence that fell over London in 1349. Yet centuries later, her story is told again. Not in her own words, but in molecules and bones. We know she was young, female, local to London, modest in diet, marked by hardship, taken by plague. We know her immune genes lacked some of the protective variants that allowed others to survive. She was, in a way, unlucky in the genetic lottery of her time. But through her DNA, she speaks, not of despair, but of resilience. For even in her death, she contributes to the survival of others, teaching us about the pathogen, about the past, about the fragile balance between humanity and disease. There is something profoundly moving in this. For centuries, she was anonymous, forgotten, one among millions. Now she is known again, not by name but by story. Her skeleton has become her voice. Ancient DNA is not only science, it is restoration. It brings back the individuality that mass death sought to erase, and she is not alone. Across Europe, other skeletons tell similar tales. In Germany, a man in his 40s, bones thick with signs of hard labor, teeth stained from years of coarse bread and ale, also carried the plague's DNA. In Italy, a child of only 10, buried with no possessions, preserved the same bacterium in their teeth. In Scandinavia, skeletons show evidence of both plague and tuberculosis, double burdens that marked their lives. Each one is a person. Each one adds a verse to the great chorus of history. The scientific process that unlocks these stories is meticulous. Archaeologists excavate carefully, documenting context. Samples are taken under sterile conditions. In the lab, DNA is extracted, sequenced, compared to reference genomes. Isotopes are measured, bones examined for pathology. The result is a multi-layered portrait. Ancestry, diet, health, cause of death. Together, these details weave biography from dust. But beyond the details lies the philosophy. Why do we tell these stories? Why do we resurrect the identities of the long dead? Partly, it is science. By understanding individuals, we understand populations, and by understanding populations, we understand evolution. But partly, it is human dignity. Each skeleton was once a living soul with hopes, fears, joys. To restore their story is to honor them, to resist the anonymity of mass death. The Black Death tried to erase individuality. Its mass graves are monuments to that erasure. But ancient DNA resists. It insists. These were not numbers. They were people. Each skeleton is a testimony. Each genome is a voice. Together, they remind us that even in the face of unimaginable loss, humanity is not statistics, but stories. Think again of the young woman from East Smithfield. Her story is now part of ours. We know her childhood hardships, her diet, her labor, her death. We know the bacterium that took her. We know the genes she carried. Through her, we connect across 7 centuries, feeling the continuity of human life. She is not forgotten. She is remembered in science, in story, in our telling. And perhaps this is the greatest gift of ancient DNA. It does not merely tell us about evolution or immunity. It gives us back the humanity of the dead. It turns silence into speech. It turns anonymity into individuality. It restores the personal in the midst of the collective. In the next part of our journey, we will widen our gaze once more. For while the story of one skeleton is poignant, the story of society is vast. The Black Death did not only shape genes and individuals, it transformed Europe itself, its culture, its economy, its very trajectory. From plague arose change, and from change, a new world. When the Black Death loosened its grip in the early 1350s, Europe was not the same as before. The bones had been buried, the pits closed, the survivors staggered back to their lives. But the world they returned to was changed forever. The Black Death was not only a biological disaster, it was a social earthquake. It cracked the foundations of feudalism, shook the authority of the church, and redirected the currents of European culture. Out of its shadow, new worlds began to form. Let us begin with the most immediate effect: labor. Before the plague, Europe was crowded. Populations had swelled through the 13th century. Land was scarce, wages were low, and peasants were bound to their lords in webs of obligation. Then came the plague. Fields emptied, villages shrank, and workers vanished. Suddenly, land was abundant, but labor was scarce. The balance shifted. Peasants who survived could demand more: higher wages, lighter obligations, sometimes even freedom. In England, records show that agricultural workers doubled their wages in the years after the plague. Lords, desperate to harvest their crops, had little choice but to agree. This shift did not happen quietly. Kings and nobles tried to resist. In England, the Crown issued the Statute of Labourers in 1351, fixing wages at pre-plague levels and punishing those who demanded more. But laws could not erase reality. Workers walked away from oppressive conditions. Entire estates fell into ruin for lack of hands. Serfdom, the old order that had tied peasants to the soil, began to wither. Over the next century, it declined steadily, replaced by wage labor and mobility. The Black Death, more than any reformer, broke the chains of feudalism. The social collapse also reshaped landholding. With so many dead, estates were abandoned, and inheritance became chaotic. A single peasant might inherit not only his parents' plot, but also the lands of uncles, cousins, or neighbors who had perished. The consolidation of property created new classes of landholders, some rising to prominence for the first time. In towns, merchants bought up abandoned houses, expanding their fortunes. Wealth shifted downward as well as upward, redistributing the map of ownership. But perhaps the most profound tremor was felt in religion. The church had been the great anchor of medieval life. It offered answers, rituals, and hope. Yet during the plague, prayers seemed powerless. Priests died alongside their flock. Monks and nuns perished in monasteries. Processions and penitents did not stop the disease. Many began to question, why had God allowed such suffering? Why had the church, with all its authority, failed to protect? Out of these doubts grew seeds of change. Some turned to mysticism, seeking personal visions of the divine. Others embraced movements like the Flagellants, who whipped themselves in public penance. Still, others began to quietly doubt the church's authority. The Reformation, which would erupt 2 centuries later, had its roots in this shaken faith. The plague also intensified suspicion and persecution. Desperate for explanations, communities sometimes turned against minorities. In parts of Europe, Jewish populations were falsely accused of poisoning wells, leading to horrific pogroms. This scapegoating revealed the dark side of fear, a reminder that pandemics test not only biology, but morality. Yet even these tragedies reshaped the social fabric, scattering communities and altering demographics. Culturally, the Black Death left an indelible mark. Art became obsessed with death. The motif of the danse macabre, the dance of death, appeared in paintings and woodcuts, showing skeletons leading nobles, peasants, and clergy alike in a grim procession. Literature turned somber, filled with meditations on mortality and the fleeting nature of life. Petrarch, mourning the loss of friends, wrote that the world seemed emptied, a shadow of what it once was. In this way, culture mirrored reality, a Europe haunted by absence. And yet, from this obsession with death came a renewed appetite for life. Survivors, acutely aware of life's fragility, sought meaning in art, learning, and human endeavor. Some historians argue that the Renaissance was, in part, born from this confrontation with mortality. With old certainties shattered, people turned to new questions. What is beauty? What is knowledge? What is the worth of human existence? Painters, sculptors, and thinkers filled the void left by plague with creativity, giving birth to one of history's greatest cultural flowerings. Economically, the plague accelerated change. With fewer mouths to feed, demand for food shifted. Farmers diversified, moving from grain to livestock. Wool production increased, fueling trade and wealth in regions like Flanders and England. Towns adapted, commerce revived, and a new middle class of merchants and artisans gained influence. The rigid order of medieval society softened, making space for mobility and innovation. Politically, the demographic collapse altered power. Nobles weakened by labor shortages, and declining rents lost authority. Monarchs, by contrast, often gained, centralizing control as feudal lords faltered. In some regions, cities asserted independence, governed by councils of merchants and guilds rather than by hereditary lords. The map of Europe did not change overnight, but its internal dynamics shifted profoundly. What emerges from all these changes is a paradox. The Black Death was devastation, yet it was also transformation. It destroyed, yet it cleared ground for renewal. It shattered the old, yet it enabled the new. Without the plague, perhaps serfdom would have lasted longer. Perhaps the Renaissance would have come later. Perhaps Europe's trajectory would have been different. History cannot be rewritten, but we can see how catastrophe became catalyst. There is a philosophical lesson here. Catastrophes are not only endings, they are also beginnings. The Black Death was not merely a hole torn in history. It was also a forge, reshaping society, economy, faith, and culture. Its victims did not die in vain. Their absence changed the lives of those who remained, and in doing so, they altered the course of the continent. As we drift deeper into this reflection, imagine standing in a medieval village in 1360, a decade after the plague. Half the houses stand empty. The churchyard is filled with fresh graves, but in the fields, survivors work with new determination. They earn better wages, eat better food, live freer lives. In the town, artists paint new visions, merchants grow wealthy, scholars gather texts from distant lands. Out of silence, new voices rise. Out of death, new life flourishes. In the next part of our journey, we will explore how these transformations were not limited to Europe. The Black Death was a global event, stretching across Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa. Its legacy there was equally profound, reshaping empires, economies, and cultures. To understand the full story, we must look beyond Europe, to the wider world swept by the same storm. The Black Death is often remembered as a European tragedy, a catastrophe that emptied villages, toppled feudal systems, and scarred the continent's culture. But its story was far wider. The plague was a global storm, sweeping across Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa before it ever reached Europe's shores. To understand its full impact, we must widen our gaze, tracing the invisible path of Yersinia pestis across the Old World. The origins of the Black Death lie in Central Asia, in the steppes where rodents carried the bacterium for centuries. The Mongol Empire, stretching from China to Eastern Europe in the 13th and 14th centuries, created the largest continuous trade network in history. The Silk Road flourished, carrying silk, spices, gems, and ideas. But it also carried fleas and rats. In this way, the Mongol peace, the Pax Mongolica, became the very channel through which the plague traveled. Historical accounts tell us of the plague striking China as early as the 1330s. Records from the Yuan dynasty describe strange outbreaks, sudden deaths, and depopulated regions. Some estimates suggest that China lost tens of millions to plague, though the numbers are uncertain. Entire provinces were said to be emptied. Famines and rebellions followed, weakening the dynasty and contributing to its eventual fall. For the Chinese people, the plague was not only a medical disaster, but a political turning point. It altered dynasties, reshaped authority, and shifted the trajectory of one of the world's great civilizations. From Central Asia, the plague moved westward, carried by caravans and armies. In Persia, the Ilkhanate, one of the successor states of the Mongol Empire, was devastated. Contemporary chronicles describe cities where corpses lay unburied, where entire households vanished. The collapse of the Ilkhanate in the mid-14th century owes much to this devastation. Political fragmentation followed, leaving Persia vulnerable to conquest and turmoil. Once again, plague acted not only as disease but as geopolitical force. The plague also struck the Middle East with terrible power. In 1347, just as Europe's first ships were bringing plague to Mediterranean ports, the disease was already ravaging the Levant. Cairo, one of the great capitals of the Islamic world, suffered immensely. Chroniclers such as al-Makrizi describe tens of thousands dying in a single day, streets filled with the dead, mosques overflowed with mourners. The Nile, lifeblood of Egypt, could not sustain the living when laborers collapsed and fields lay fallow. The Mamluk Sultanate staggered under the weight of loss. In Mecca and Medina, the holiest cities of Islam, pilgrims carried the plague along trade and religious routes. Even sacred ground offered no immunity. Faith endured, but confidence in worldly stability faltered. Scholars debated the meaning of the catastrophe. Was it divine punishment, a test of faith, or a natural calamity? These debates shaped Islamic thought for generations. Just as in Europe, the plague shook Christianity. From the Middle East, plague traveled southward into North Africa. In cities like Tunis and Fez, the toll was immense. Ibn Khaldun, the great Arab historian, lost his parents and many relatives to the plague. He later wrote that the world had changed into another world after the catastrophe. His reflections remind us that pandemics are not only events, but turning points in human consciousness. They alter how societies see themselves, their histories, and their futures. Trade suffered across all these regions. The bustling markets of the Silk Road grew quiet. Caravans dwindled as merchants died or refused to travel. Ports that once brimmed with ships fell silent. Economic collapse compounded human tragedy. Entire industries vanished, from Chinese silk workshops to Persian crafts to Egyptian grain exports. The arteries of global exchange narrowed, weakening empires and isolating communities. And yet, as in Europe, the aftermath also brought change. In China, the decline of the Yuan dynasty gave rise to the Ming, a new order shaped partly by the chaos of plague. In Persia, power shifted, new dynasties rose, and old ones crumbled. In the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire emerged in the century that followed, rising partly in the vacuum left by plague's destruction. The Black Death did not only kill, it rearranged the map of empires. Culturally, the memory of the plague echoed in literature and scholarship. In Islamic societies, Poets and theologians wrote of the fragility of life, of the suddenness of death. In China, art reflected both loss and resilience. In North Africa, Ibn Khaldun's philosophy, linking plague to cycles of history, became one of the most influential frameworks for understanding civilization itself. Just as Europe produced its Dance of Death, Asia and Africa produced their own meditations on mortality. What emerges from this wider view is a recognition. The Black Death was not Europe's alone. It was global. It reshaped China's dynasties, Persia's politics, Egypt's economy, and North Africa's philosophy. It altered trade networks, religious debates, and imperial trajectories. To remember it only as a European event is to miss its true scale. There is also a deeper philosophical lesson here. We often think of history in regional silos: European history, Asian history, Islamic history. But the Black Death ignores such divisions. It was a storm without borders, carried by rats and fleas that cared nothing for human frontiers. It reminds us that humanity shares vulnerabilities. What strikes one corner of the world will, in time, strike another. Our stories are interconnected, our fates entwined. As we drift further into this narrative, imagine the vast arc of the plague. From a rodent burrow in Central Asia to a caravan in Persia, from a pilgrim caravan in Mecca to a ship in Alexandria, from a London alley to a Paris market. Everywhere it went, it left emptiness, but also transformation. The Black Death was not simply a European tragedy. It was a world tragedy, a common trial endured by diverse peoples, each leaving their own memories, their own responses, their own legacies. In the next part of our journey, we will look closely at those responses, the attempts to explain, to control, to endure. For when faced with catastrophe, societies do not only suffer, they also search for meaning. The Black Death sparked waves of superstition, science, faith, and fear. To understand the full story, we must explore how humans explained the unexplainable. When the Black Death descended on Europe and the wider world, people faced not only the terror of death, but also the terror of the unknown. They saw loved ones fall ill in the morning and die by night. They saw whole families vanish in days, whole villages in weeks. They saw priests collapse at altars, doctors succumb beside their patients, neighbors carried out on carts. And yet, they did not know why. Without knowledge of bacteria, of fleas, of microbes invisible to the naked eye, medieval people reached for explanations they could understand. Those explanations were shaped by faith, by fear, by superstition, and by the fragile hope of meaning in a world undone. The most common explanation was divine punishment. Medieval life was steeped in religion. The Church taught that God controlled every aspect of the world, rewarding virtue and punishing sin. The scale of the plague seemed proof of wrath. Preachers declared that humanity had angered heaven. Greed, lust, pride, heresy, all were cited as reasons. The only remedy, it seemed, was repentance. Cities organized processions of penitents. Barefoot and weeping, crowds marched through the streets, chanting prayers, begging for mercy. Bells rang endlessly. Priests held masses for the dead and the living alike. People confessed, fasted, and gave alms, hoping to appease the divine. Out of this climate of fear grew the movement of the flagellants. Bands of men traveled from town to town, stripping to the waist, whipping themselves with scourges tipped with metal. They believed that only by sharing Christ's suffering could humanity be forgiven. They marched in lines, chanting hymns, their backs raw with blood. Townspeople watched in awe, terror, or admiration. Some joined, hoping to find safety in ritual pain. Authorities alternately tolerated and condemned them, fearing their fervor might challenge church control. But for months and years, the flagellants wandered, embodying a desperate faith in suffering as cure. Others turned to the heavens. Astrology was a respected science in the 14th century, blending observation with belief. Scholars studied the stars and planets, seeking patterns in their movements. The plague, they declared, was caused by a conjunction of planets, a corruption of the air under Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars. Pamphlets circulated, charts drawn, predictions made. If the disease came from the skies, then it was both unavoidable and universal, an affliction written in the heavens themselves. Still others believed in miasma, the corruption of air. Rotting bodies, foul smells, swamp vapors, these were thought to breed sickness. In this belief lay the seeds of a kind of public health. Towns tried to cleanse their streets, burning aromatic herbs, lighting fires to purify the air, ordering citizens to avoid foul odors. Doctors carried pomanders filled with spices and vinegar, their long-beaked masks stuffed with herbs to filter the corruption. Though misguided, these practices sometimes helped, reducing exposure to filth and contagion. But fear also bred scapegoats. In many places, Jews were accused of poisoning wells, of conspiring to destroy Christendom. Rumors spread quickly, fueled by desperation and prejudice. Pogroms followed, massacres of Jewish communities in Strasbourg, Mainz, Cologne, and beyond. Thousands were killed, entire neighborhoods burned. These tragedies remind us that pandemics unleash not only microbes, but also human cruelty. When people cannot explain disaster, they invent enemies. Superstition flourished in countless other forms. Some wore charms or amulets, hoping to ward off death. Others carried written prayers, hung herbs in doorways, or painted protective symbols on walls. Quacks sold potions of garlic, vinegar, or ground gemstones. In Italy, some wealthy fled to country villas, believing distance alone could save them. Others, resigned to fate, plunged into hedonism, feasting, drinking, and abandoning restraint, convinced that tomorrow might never come. And yet, amid fear and superstition, there were also glimmers of reasoned observation. Some cities experimented with quarantine. In Venice, officials noticed that sailors carried plague from abroad. They ordered ships to wait offshore for 40 days, 40 giorni, the origin of our word quarantine. Though imperfect, this slowed the spread. In Milan, when plague struck households, entire homes were walled up, sealing the sick inside, harsh but effective. These measures show that even in the 14th century, people began to sense patterns of contagion, the beginnings of public health. Doctors, though powerless, left behind writings that reveal both superstition and insight. The Paris Faculty of Medicine, asked to explain the plague in 1348, produced a report citing planetary conjunctions, corrupted air, and imbalance of humors. Yet some physicians also noted that proximity to the sick seemed dangerous, that isolation could help, that fumigation mattered. They were groping toward truths not yet visible. Philosophically, what all these reactions reveal is the human need for meaning. Death was terrifying, but meaningless death was worse. People needed explanations, divine punishment, poisoned wells, planetary misalignment, because explanations gave shape to chaos. Even false stories offered comfort, a sense that disaster could be understood, perhaps even controlled. Without them, the plague was pure terror, a void without reason. And so, medieval Europe filled the void with stories, rituals, and fears. Faith was tested, superstition multiplied, cruelty erupted, and reason flickered faintly. In their mixture, we see humanity laid bare, desperate for hope, vulnerable to fear, yet striving always to understand. Centuries later, we may smile at these explanations. We know the truth: a bacterium, fleas, rats, trade routes. But perhaps we should not smile too quickly. Even today, in modern pandemics, fear breeds misinformation. Rumors spread, scapegoats are found. Science battles superstition. The 14th century is not so distant. The same human heart beats in us. The same need for meaning drives us still. As we close this chapter, imagine again the streets of a plague-stricken town. Bells toll. Smoke of incense and herbs drifts through the air. Processions wind through alleys, prayers rising, whips cracking on backs. In cellars, Jews hide from angry mobs. On ships, sailors wait offshore, counting days of quarantine. In mansions, nobles feast as if tomorrow will not come. In cottages, peasants cling to crucifixes, whispering pleas to heaven. This was not science, not knowledge, but it was survival of another kind, the survival of the spirit in the face of the incomprehensible. In the next part of our journey, we will see how the plague reshaped not only faith and fear, but also medicine itself. For out of failure, new questions arose, and from those questions, the long path toward modern science began. In the 14th century, medicine stood at a crossroads between ancient tradition and the faint stirrings of modern science. Doctors, trained in the universities of Paris, Bologna, or Oxford, spoke the language of Aristotle and Galen. They studied the balance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and they believed health was harmony among them. Sickness, they taught, was imbalance. This framework had endured for over 1,000 years, shaping every diagnosis, every treatment. But when the Black Death arrived, the humors faltered. No theory of imbalance could explain the suddenness of the plague. No mixture of herbs or bloodletting could halt its advance. Medicine, for all its learning, stood powerless. Doctors did what they could. They prescribed bloodletting, hoping to draw out poisoned humors. They ordered patients to avoid baths, believing water opened the pores to corruption. They advised aromatic herbs, rosemary, sage, lavender, to cleanse the air. They recommended diets of light meats, fresh fruit, or in some cases, abstinence from all but bread and water. In desperation, some turned to charms and incantations, blurring the line between medicine and magic. None of it worked. Patients died anyway, often within days. The image that endures from this period is the plague doctor, cloaked in long robes, gloves, and boots, face hidden behind a mask shaped like a bird's beak. The beak was stuffed with herbs and vinegar-soaked sponges, meant to filter the miasma, the corrupted air thought to carry disease. The glass eyepieces and waxed leather cloak were meant as barriers. Though based on flawed ideas, the costume did offer a crude form of protection, shielding doctors from fleas and contaminated droplets. It became one of the most haunting symbols of the era, a figure both grotesque and tragic, embodying medicine's struggle against the invisible. Despite their failures, doctors did not stop observing. Some began to notice patterns. They saw that plague spread more in crowded places than in isolated ones. They noted that proximity to the sick was dangerous. They recorded symptoms carefully: the swellings, the blackened skin, the sudden fevers. These records, though rooted in flawed theories, preserved valuable data. In Milan, officials ordered houses of the infected walled shut, a harsh form of quarantine that slowed the spread. In Venice, ships from plague-stricken regions were held offshore for 40 days, 40 giorni. From failure emerged the first experiments in public health. Universities and medical faculties debated endlessly. The Faculty of Medicine in Paris, asked to explain the plague in 1348, produced a report blaming the conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars, which they said had corrupted the air. Yet alongside astrology, they also recommended cleanliness, avoidance of the sick, and fumigation. We see here a curious blend, superstition and proto-science, mingled in the same breath. As the plague returned in waves over the following centuries, medicine slowly evolved. By the 15th and 16th centuries, physicians began to question Galen's ancient authority. The Renaissance, with its emphasis on observation and rediscovery of classical texts, encouraged new thinking. Anatomists like Vesalius dissected human bodies, correcting centuries of error. Surgeons, once dismissed as mere barbers, gained respect through practical skill. Alchemists experimented with chemicals, laying groundwork for pharmacology. Each step was small, but each was fueled by the urgency of plague's repeated return. The Black Death, in this way, was both a crisis and a catalyst. It revealed the limits of old systems. It forced doctors to look more closely, to record more carefully, to seek new ideas. Without microscopes, they could not yet see the true enemy, but their persistence kept alive the quest for understanding. The failure of humoral medicine, in the face of plague, created the space into which modern science would eventually step. Consider the irony. The very ineffectiveness of medieval medicine was, in the long run, its gift. Had humoral treatments succeeded even partially, they might have reinforced ancient theories, delaying progress. Instead, their futility exposed the need for change. Plague forced medicine to confront reality, to admit ignorance, and to begin the slow, painful journey toward evidence-based science. Yet we should not be too harsh on medieval doctors. They worked with what they had. Their language of humors, astrology, and miasma was not folly, but an attempt to impose order on the unknown. In their observations of contagion, in their quarantines, in their attention to symptoms, we see the beginnings of epidemiology. Their beaked masks, strange as they seem, were early experiments in protective gear. In their mixture of failure and insight, we see the long road to science winding forward. Philosophically, this reveals a truth. Science often grows not from success, but from failure. It is when theories collapse, when explanations falter, that new paths open. The Black Death was medicine's great failure, but also its great teacher. It humbled doctors, shook ancient authorities, and pushed human curiosity toward new horizons. As we drift further into this reflection, imagine again the scene of a plague doctor walking through a stricken town. His robes rustle, his beak mask looms. Children hide in fear at his approach. He kneels beside a patient, examines the swollen buboes, prescribes herbs, perhaps bleeds the arm. The patient dies anyway. The doctor writes notes in his ledger, records another failure, and moves on. He does not know that centuries later, scientists will look back at his work, see in it not only futility, but the seeds of progress. His failures, written in ink, preserved in archives, became the soil in which modern medicine would grow. In the next part of our story, we will leave the realm of medicine and turn to the arts once more. For just as plague reshaped science, it reshaped imagination. It haunted painters, sculptors, and poets, filling Europe with visions of death and reminders of life's brevity. If medicine struggled to heal bodies, art sought to heal souls. When death fills the streets, art cannot remain untouched. The Black Death was not only a medical and social catastrophe, it was also a cultural wound. Painters, sculptors, poets, and storytellers, confronted with mass mortality, turned their crafts into mirrors of the crisis. Out of horror emerged new imagery, new stories, and, paradoxically, the seeds of rebirth. In Plague's shadow, European art was reshaped, first with visions of despair, then with a renewed passion for life that would blossom into the Renaissance. The earliest artistic response was an obsession with death itself. Skeletons, skulls, and decay filled canvases and manuscripts. One of the most enduring motifs was the danse macabre, the dance of death. In murals and woodcuts across Europe, death was shown as a skeleton leading men and women of every class, kings, bishops, merchants, peasants, in a grim procession. The message was stark. Death comes for all. No crown, no wealth, no prayer can halt its steps. The dance of death reflected both terror and equality, reminding medieval viewers that plague had stripped away all social barriers. Another powerful image was the triumph of death, captured famously in a fresco in Palermo. Armies of skeletons sweep across landscapes, cutting down nobles and peasants alike. Corpses litter the ground, while survivors cower in fear. These apocalyptic visions were not subtle. They reflected a society that had looked into the abyss and could not look away. Death was no longer distant. It was immediate, universal, triumphant. Religious art also shifted. Medieval Europe was profoundly Christian, and artists sought to place the plague within a spiritual framework. Paintings of the Madonna of Mercy multiplied. Mary shone, spreading her cloak to shelter the faithful from arrows of plague. Christ appeared as judge, saints as protectors, angels as comforters. In these works, art became prayer, a plea for divine intercession. Churches filled with images meant not to terrify but to console, to offer hope in the midst of despair. Literature mirrored these dual impulses, fear and hope. In Italy, Giovanni Boccaccio wrote The Decameron, framing a collection of tales within the story of young nobles fleeing Florence to escape the plague. His introduction describes in chilling detail the horrors of the city, bodies piled in streets, families abandoning each other, despair everywhere. But then, within the safety of the countryside, his characters tell stories, comic, tragic, romantic. The message is subtle but profound. Even in catastrophe, life continues, stories endure, laughter survives. Petrarch, the poet and humanist, also wrote of plague. He mourned the death of his beloved Laura, who perished in 1348. His sonnets are filled with grief, but also with longing for beauty and meaning in a broken world. He wrote of solitude, of the fragility of life, of the need to seek wisdom beyond the ruins. In his voice we hear not only loss, but the beginnings of Renaissance humanism, a turning toward the inner life, the dignity of man, and the power of art to endure. Music, too, bore the imprint of plague. Funeral chants filled churches. Composers experimented with somber tones, harmonies that evoked mourning. Some songs carried refrains about death and transience, yet others turned toward joy, as if to defy despair with sound. Even in melody, the tension between horror and hope played out. As decades passed, art began to move beyond death's shadow. By the 15th century, survivors and their descendants, still haunted by plague, also hungered for renewal. The Renaissance, rebirth, was partly a response to that hunger. Artists turned to classical antiquity, seeking inspiration in Greek and Roman ideals of beauty, proportion, and human dignity. Painters like Giotto, Masaccio, and later Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci infused their work with humanism, emphasizing not only divine glory, but also human potential. Here lies the paradox. The Black Death filled Europe with images of death, but it also helped awaken a culture of life. By stripping away illusions of permanence, plague forced people to confront mortality. And in that confrontation, many chose to affirm life more fiercely. They sought knowledge, art, beauty, wisdom, not as luxuries, but as necessities in a fragile world. The Renaissance, with its explosion of creativity, can be seen as an answer to the silence of the plague. Art preserved cultural memory of the catastrophe. The skeletons of the Danse Macabre, the desperate prayers of the Madonna of Mercy, the sorrow of Petrarch's sonnets, all remind us that the 14th century was an age of grief. But Renaissance frescoes, sculptures, and treatises remind us that grief gave way to vision. From horror to humanism, from silence to song, art carried Europe through darkness into light. Philosophically, this arc reveals the dual power of creativity. Art absorbs pain, reflecting it back to society. But art also transforms pain, turning it into meaning, into beauty, into renewal. The Black Death was an abyss, but art built a bridge across it, leading to the Renaissance. As we drift further into this reflection, imagine walking into a medieval church. On one wall, a fresco of the Danse Macabre, skeletons dragging bishops and kings to the grave. On another, a painting of the Virgin sheltering her children beneath her cloak. Above, chants echo, solemn and haunting. Outside, in the streets, survivors rebuild their lives. And in the centuries to come, in the same city, artists will carve marble statues of grace, paint ceilings of wonder, and compose music of transcendence. All of it, in some way, answers the memory of plague. In the next part of our journey, we will move from art to economy. For just as culture was reshaped, so too were markets, trade, and wealth. The Black Death was not only a cultural and spiritual event, it was also an economic revolution, one that changed how societies worked and how people lived. The Black Death was not only a biological and cultural disaster, it was also an economic earthquake, shaking the foundations of medieval society. In the space of a few short years, markets collapsed, fields went untended, trade faltered. Yet from this devastation emerged transformation. The plague did not merely destroy wealth, it redistributed it, rearranged it, and in doing so, set Europe on a new economic path, one that would eventually lead to capitalism, global trade, and modern finance. When the plague first struck, the immediate economic effect was paralysis. Cities fell silent, markets emptied, merchants abandoned their stalls, ships lay idle in harbors, their crews dead or fleeing. Caravans ceased to move along the roads. Fear itself was as destructive as the disease. Few dared to buy, sell, or travel when death seemed to follow every exchange. In Florence, chroniclers describe shops shuttered, moneylenders gone, artisans vanished. In Paris, guilds dissolved as masters and apprentices alike perished. In London, the once crowded markets of Cheapside stood eerily quiet. Agriculture suffered even more. Across Europe, fields lay fallow. Crops rotted in the ground for lack of harvesters. Entire villages were abandoned. Lords, once proud of their vast estates, found themselves unable to find laborers to plow or reap. The great wealth of the medieval economy, its land, suddenly became useless without hands to work it. Food shortages followed in some regions, though paradoxically, with fewer mouths to feed, surpluses also appeared elsewhere. Markets were chaotic, supply and demand thrown into violent imbalance. But from this chaos emerged a shift. Labor, once abundant and cheap, had become scarce and valuable. Survivors could demand higher wages, better conditions, Even mobility once denied them. Records from England show wages for agricultural workers rising by as much as 100% in the decades after the plague. Governments tried to resist. The Statute of Laborers of 1351 attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and punish workers who demanded more. But laws could not change reality. Landowners competed for scarce labor, driving wages up. Serfdom, the old system that bound peasants to the soil, began to crumble. By the 15th century, in much of Western Europe, it was a memory. The redistribution of wealth was dramatic. With so many dead, inheritances multiplied. A single survivor might inherit land, houses, and goods from several branches of family wiped out. Merchants who lived found themselves inheriting shops and contracts from rivals. Widows remarried, bringing property into new households. Wealth flowed in unexpected directions, breaking old concentrations and creating new ones. Urban life, too, was transformed. With fewer people, towns could not support all their old guilds and businesses. But survivors who remained often thrived. Artisans found less competition. Merchants gained greater shares of markets. Families who had once been poor rose to prominence. The very fabric of the city changed, narrower, more mobile, more open to newcomers. Trade networks, though disrupted, eventually revived. In some regions, demand for luxury goods even increased as survivors sought to display newfound wealth. Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa regained dominance in Mediterranean trade, connecting Europe with the wider world. In the north, the Hanseatic League expanded its reach across the Baltic and North Seas. The plague had pruned populations, but it also cleared space for new forms of commerce. One of the most profound consequences was the rise of a money economy. With serfdom declining and wage labor spreading, money became central in ways it had not before. Peasants paid rent instead of labor. Workers demanded coin instead of service. Markets expanded. Credit systems deepened. Banking families like the Medici rose. The plague had cleared the way for the transition from a feudal economy of obligations to an emerging capitalist economy of contracts. Even the landscape changed. In England, landlords shifted from labor-intensive grain farming to sheep pastures, which required fewer workers. Wool became a booming industry, exported to Flanders and beyond. This shift created fortunes for landowners and merchants, fueling the textile trade that would power Europe's economy for centuries. It also reshaped the countryside, replacing villages with open fields, peasants with flocks. The irony of plague economics is stark. Death created opportunity. Those who survived lived better than their parents. They ate more meat, wore finer clothes, enjoyed larger houses. Archaeological studies confirm improvements in diet and health after the plague, fewer signs of malnutrition, stronger bones, longer lifespans for survivors. Tragedy for one generation became prosperity for the next, but prosperity carried new tensions. Lords resented the rising power of peasants. Governments resisted wage increases. In 1381, England erupted in the peasants' revolt, fueled by frustrations over taxes and labor laws. Similar uprisings appeared in France and elsewhere. The plague had weakened feudal structures, but the struggle over what would replace them was fierce. Out of this struggle, modern notions of freedom, rights, and labor began to grow. Philosophically, the economic consequences of the Black Death reveal a paradox: catastrophe as creator. The plague emptied treasuries, yet it redistributed wealth. It destroyed labor forces, yet it empowered workers. It silenced markets, yet it accelerated the shift toward capitalism. In death's shadow, The seeds of modernity sprouted. Consider again the markets of Europe a generation after the plague. In Florence, bankers count gold florins as merchants trade wool and silk. In London, peasants walk more freely, negotiating wages with landowners. In Bruges, ships unload goods from the Baltic, bringing grain and timber. In villages, families eat better, their children healthier, their futures brighter. This was not the world that entered the plague. It was a new world, born painfully, but born nonetheless. The Black Death was thus both an ending and a beginning. It ended the medieval economy of rigid feudal bonds. It began the early modern economy of wages, markets, and trade. Its victims could not know that their deaths would shape the rise of capitalism, the growth of cities, the wealth of merchants, the voyages of discovery. Yet in their absence, the economic stage was reset, and history marched forward on a new path. In the next part of our journey, we will turn from markets to memory once more. For economics explains how people lived, but memory explains how they understood. The Black Death haunted minds as much as it shaped markets. Its legacy was not only in coins and contracts, but in the stories and symbols people carried for generations. The Black Death ended nearly 7 centuries ago, but it has never truly ended. Its victims lie in the earth, their bones silent, their names forgotten. Yet its echoes remain. In our DNA, in our societies, in our cultures, and in our collective imagination. To finish this long journey through plague, we must consider its legacy, what it left behind, how it shaped us, and why it still matters today. The most intimate legacy is biological. In the genomes of modern Europeans, the Black Death left scars. Variants of immune system genes like ERAP2 were selected for survival. They gave ancestors a better chance against plague, but they also predisposed descendants to autoimmune disease. This is the double-edged sword of evolution. What saves one generation may trouble the next. The plague wrote itself into our DNA, not as memory, but as adaptation, a biological inheritance that continues to influence health centuries later. In this way, every breath we take carries a faint echo of the 14th century. The second legacy is social and economic. Before the plague, Europe was bound in the chains of feudalism. Serfs tilled the land, nobles reaped the harvest, kings and clergy ruled above. The Black Death shattered this order. With half the population gone, labor became scarce, wages rose, serfs gained freedom, and land changed hands. The rigid pyramid of medieval society began to tilt. From its cracks emerged the first shoots of modern capitalism, wage labor, and mobility. Without the plague, Europe's economic transformation might have come slower, later. With it, change accelerated, pushing the continent toward the modern age. The third legacy is cultural. Art, literature, and religion were reshaped. In paintings, skeletons danced with kings. In frescoes, armies of death swept across landscapes. In poetry, grief gave birth to beauty. In sermons, despair gave way to reform. Petrarch mourned his beloved. Boccaccio spun tales of escape. Painters filled walls with visions of mortality. Out of this obsession with death grew a hunger for life, one that fueled the Renaissance. The Black Death, by confronting Europe with its fragility, also awakened its creativity. From ashes rose not only mourning, but masterpieces. The fourth legacy is memory, not just in DNA or art, but in the stories societies tell. The Black Death remains one of the great symbols of human vulnerability. It appears in novels, films, and plays as shorthand for apocalypse. It echoes in our language. When we speak of something plague-like, we invoke its terror. It surfaced again during COVID-19, when newspapers and commentators compared empty streets and overflowing hospitals to those of 1348. Memory is not only in the past, it resurfaces whenever the present feels fragile. And yet, the Black Death's legacy is not only one of fear, it is also one of resilience. Humanity endured. Survivors rebuilt villages, replanted fields, restarted trade. They mourned, but they also married, had children, created art, wrote books, and sang songs. Out of catastrophe, life returned. This cycle, death and renewal, despair and resilience, is perhaps the truest legacy of plague. It teaches that humanity bends, but does not break, suffers but also adapts, remembers but also moves forward. Philosophically, the Black Death forces us to ask, what does it mean to be human in the face of catastrophe? For medieval people, it meant turning to God, to ritual, to community, to superstition, to art. For us today, it may mean turning to science, to medicine, to technology. But the underlying impulse is the same, to seek meaning, to endure, to survive. In this way, the Black Death links us to our ancestors. Their fear was our fear. Their resilience is our resilience. As we close this long journey, imagine the layers of legacy. In the marrow of your bones, mutations shaped by plague still whisper. In your culture, stories and images still echo with its memory. In your society, freedoms and economic systems born of its aftermath still define daily life. You are, in some sense, a descendant of plague, not only by blood, but by structure, by story, by imagination. The Black Death ended lives, but it also shaped lives to come. Its victims are silent, but they are not forgotten. Their absence reshaped the world. Their suffering gave lessons that endure. Their memory, biological and cultural, still lives in us. And so, as the bells of history toll across centuries, the Black Death reminds us of the fragile balance of life, of the inevitability of change, and of the enduring strength of humanity. It was one of history's darkest hours, but from its shadows, new light emerged. To study it is not only to understand the past, but to recognize ourselves in resilience, in vulnerability, in the search for meaning that never ends. This is the lasting legacy of the Black Death. Not only the millions it took, but the billions it shaped. Not only the despair it sowed, but the renewal it sparked. Not only the silence of graves, but the voices of memory that still speak.